Okay, we're on.
Okay. You see all this? There.
Ooh, I'm excited about Mongol invasion.
Yeah, I like the Mongol invasion part.
Yeah, that was a quick backwards foreshadowing. All right, cool. Well, so this has changed a bit since I last renamed it, but basically it came up in regards to a conversation that I had with Gabriel a couple weeks ago that helped me kind of structure it. And basically the question I came in with was like, how could I structure the research into logistics and states and generally what we've called like the TB, the second exchange transcendental, with the kind of concepts that have been used in the primer so far without, because I'm not a mathematician, getting caught up in all the formalisms. So working out with Gabriel, we came up with the top half of this slide here, which is to try to isolate an inconsistency, transcendental function, local consistency, anomalous components, all the things that are part of the primer. And that's what I'm going to do, and I'll get to briefly. But in order to kind of position this, like in terms of the context of what we've been talking about, there are 4 things that have really been making me think a lot from the talks. Like last talk, actually, and I'm going to show the next slide, gave me a really good image on how to kind of like diagram out the problem of sovereignty, and I'll get to that. We've been talking a lot about material effects of organizational forms, and that's a lot of what Lefebvre gets into, and that's a source that Gabriel recommended to me. And that Toscano, of course, is like the basis for the article that I sent out to y'all. Trying to explore the state in a way that goes beyond just critiques of the state, and so that's to kind of look for the space that is opened on TB for experimentation. And I think I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of part 5 of the primer, the closing remarks about how you can explore a space. And you talk about ultra filters, I have no clue actually how that applies, but like that there's a space there that can be explored. And then ultimately the compositional point of view. So before I actually start getting into stuff, I did want to make one theoretical caveat. And I'm actually curious, Gabriel and Dennis and others, what y'all think of this. Because basically there's a lot of different things from this subset for theoretical practice for this research group that I think are very solid outcomes, whether you're talking about the embedding hypothesis and experimentation at higher scales, compositional point of view, the categorical modeling of marks, scale sensitivity, space of reasons, et cetera, et cetera. There's like a lot of different things that are useful, even if the particular idea that we're developing and that I'm going to be emphasizing in this presentation from Karatani of the 3 exchange transcendentals doesn't actually hold up. Even if we end up deciding that that's not the best possible way to cut up economic reality or social formations, that doesn't actually, I don't think, undermine just about any other part of the research. And likewise, the subjects I'm going to get into today, I think still have value from like the organizational point of view, compositional point of view, even if they don't ultimately get expressed in terms of TB or like Boolean logic. So that's just something I've been thinking about. I don't know actually if you agree with that, Gabriel and Dennis or others, or what you think.
I mean, it all sounds amazing to me.
But I mean, specifically that caveat, does that seem like you can disentangle the TATB-TC hypothesis from the rest of the work?
I mean, so that
Yeah,
I think
okay.
already, when you remember those circles that Gabriel drew a few weeks ago, that already gives you like I guess levels of generalization, right?
Mm-hmm.
So already from there we see that, I mean, all of like this categorical compositional point of view type things still apply, I think, right?
Yeah, I don't see I think that there are different things you can ask. right? I mean, you can, for example, in the primer, most of it, the question we're trying to answer, like just pretty much rehashing what Mark already said, is what is proper to the logic of value, right? And the logic of capital valorization and so on. That implies that you're taking a lot of stuff out of the table. It implies that you are possibly at parts talking about things which don't only happen in capitalism, right? So we have ample recordings of commodity exchange in local accidental ways, much before capitalism. So you don't need like all the complex structure of many layers under domination of capital to talk about some of these things, right? I think that talking about one logic is possible, talking about how they might coexist in different ways, so social formations in general is possible, and talking about capitalism with many layers and capital, the logic of value as a dominating one is a third thing. They don't really, the third version requires the other two to be true, right? To talk about capitalism as a social formation with many layers and value as a dominating one assumes many presuppositions. But at the most basic, you could study, I don't know, the logic of states. Even if it requires other things to exist, you could bracket those things and study it on its own without having to assume everything else.
No, I understand that. I just mean specifically listing out those three, TA, TB, and TC. There are plausibly other categorizations. I don't have one in mind. I'm just saying that this seems like it's not intrinsic to the rest of the research project that it holds.
The idea that there are others other than A, B, and C, is that what you're saying? I'm having a hard time understanding exactly what would be the question. Like, what are you? Is the question like, well, the need that there are only three? Is that the thing you're questioning?
Yeah, that not so much there are only three in the sense that TD could be an experiment, but more that there might be a better way to cut up existing reality than these three exchange. I don't know if there is one, but like if you look at Karatani's text, like he quotes Marx giving these three categories, but there's never like they're postulated, right? So I think that there's a neatness to it all that, as much as like I find appealing and compelling and explanatory, I'm also like just wanting to put out that it's like I'm still like it's still an open question. I think a lot of other people would be critical. That's all. Like it was just I'm not trying to get caught up in a huge thing of just
if anyone questions it, you should say something like, dude, everyone thinks there's only one. We're moving from 1 to 3. Give us a break. We are already like
well, it's also it's less it's a theoretical caveat, but there's also part of it that's just strategic too. Like if I could see a lot of different schools of thought from a lot of different perspectives being critical of the way that logic's being mapped, and I think you can defend most of the rest of the system without this logic. That's my basic point. Not that like there's a lot, the things stand on their own without this particular component. That's basically.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you see what Alan put in the chat, that the modes of exchange, questioning if the modes of exchange really describe like reality. I think that's a sorry, I have a beeping car in the background. I hope that's not too annoying. But that it's more of a model to think about reality, right? Like you can't completely separate the state from capital in like actually functioning capitalism, right? So I mean, I think understanding how the inconsistencies work between the three fields, and obviously they're an idealization, but it provides a perspective to think about it, I think is really what is useful.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, I don't think there's any particular disagreement or even much of a thing here, so I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Yeah, I agree. Like capital and capitalism, it's really good. All right, let's see. So here's a diagram that I drew because we like diagrams, but also I found it helpful and also a way to connect, I think, 3 different strains of conversation around the particular question. So in Logics of Worlds, in the scholium on the transcendental functor, Badu uses the transcendental functor to analyze the Battle of Gaugamela between Alexander and I think Darius II of Persia, but Greek, Macedonia and Persia. And I meant to pull down a map of it because it is a very like formally neat battle the way Alexander beat the Persians, but I'll pull that up later. But basically like that gives a particular like viewpoint at a particular like level of scale that is one of like, I don't think this is necessarily a complete list, but it gives an idea of several different levels that have to be looked at in the same kind of sovereign gaze, in the same kind of position of I think universal exposition, like analogous to where capital is in the primer, that can see these different states and keep track of the differences between them. And so on the right, I utilized John C. Reynolds is like the computer science counterpart to Girard. He came up with all the computer sciencey things at Parallel System F. And he defined a type structure as a syntactic discipline for enforcing levels of abstraction. And that seems like a really neat and simple way to talk about what has to be accomplished by sovereignty in order to like manage the sophistication of a state. And that's really what we're going to look at in the Mongol Empire, is the unprecedented level of effective management and logistical organization that the Mongols were able to carry out. That is much more than any kind of like savage barbarity or whatever has been said about them. It was much more the effectiveness and their like incredible logistical and combative like recombination of old techniques into new techniques that made them so effective. If anything, they were less barbaric because they didn't have to be. So that's an image, I think. Now on the right hand side are this idea of kinds, which you know, they're not necessarily like higher order types as I understand them. They're more like describing just the basic like level of where they all sit. And so like there are two basic like problems, I'd say, when you're looking at state, which is looking at it more or less, I would say like diachronically, which is on the lower level, which is as a series of dominant issues which have to be dealt with, in this case, like a war, and a more synchronic point of view, which has to look at all the components and how they're fitting together in any given point, right? And obviously those two are mapping onto each other, but you have to be able to distinguish them at any given point. And again, I think what the Mongols really did, and in a way that's much more like interesting, I think, as a paradigm of empire than like the Romans or whatever, is the way that they simplified down their system so much that this kind of abstraction could be handled like in an actual like informational processing informatic kind of way. So, but before I get to the Mongols, I wanted to go through two different thinkers, Lefebvre and Giancarlo Rota, who provide some concepts that are going to be important. And I also want to give my own kind of attempt to analogize the primer and then make a case for it through a bunch of stuff that one day will become more like case studies. All right, so in the article, for anyone that got a chance to read it, Toscano cites Lefebvre at length. This article, all this stuff is based on an article from Lefebvre, 1977, I think, called Space and the State, or maybe State and Space. But those two things are the main issue is how does the state manage space, and in particular, the state having a kind of privileged relationship to space that puts it into simultaneously conflict with capitalism, but also allows it to kind of like supplement where capitalism is weak in reproducing itself. And so some of the defining characteristics of the state mode of production, as opposed to earlier traditionally called like laissez-faire, is like it takes over and begins to manage and look at as a whole the growth of forces of production. It's not concerned with any given sector of industry, like it itself is not concerned with it. It's concerned with how any given sector fits into the whole. It's also concerned with urbanization, specifically insofar as their concentrations and opportunities to organize massive production and consumption units. and it is concerned with spatialization itself. And again, I think you see that with the Mongols. Like you're concerned with how space is organized and with how you transform political problems into problems of space. The three ways space exists for the state and the way that space that has been organized by the state exists for others is as a national territory in terms of like actual borders, guards, enforcement, and all the kind of bureaucratic apparatus and geographic stuff you need for that. The social spaces that are managed, whether those are publicly owned kind of spaces, parks and whatnot, or regulation of public spaces like the regulation of bars, or the kind of social spaces that kind of fall under more like ideological state apparatus like schools and whatnot. But all the spaces within which socialization occurs, especially as against like the private space of the family, increasingly get regulated and controlled by the state. And then finally, mental space, like the state constructs and represents itself. And Lefebvre links this later in the article to the actual technocracy and the actual bureaucracy, that there is a way that they manage the internal representation, the mental space occupied by the state in various levels of society, and they're invested in which levels of society have which kind of representation. And in the era of SMP, which I think it's fair to say, like, whatever we identify as like the era of state capitalism, certainly post-war, is three different kind of vectors that are constantly clashing into each other, and which the state is constantly trying to deal with. First and foremost, within capitalist system, there are the various competing and fragmentary demands of capital. And those in and of themselves, even though the state is committed to reproducing capitalist relations of production, it's also constantly in antagonism with particular capitals, with instigating, like carrying out homogenization. And one thing, like at least here in the States, that like I see a lot, or like specific communities are trying to prevent like roads from going in, public transit from going in, things like that, where there's an overall drive to institute like a standardization of some kind of public infrastructure. And you generally have like small groups of business owners organized through like chambers of commerce or whatever, which put up resistance to that kind of like logistical homogenization. Which is different, incidentally, from the third one, and importantly so, though they do like overlap and can like in practice like aren't so easily separable. Because the third is the rise of more and more user movements, which a lot of things like occupied a lot of user movement tendencies. Gezi Park in Turkey started with an explicit like protest against urban development, and turned into a much larger like political economic protest movement. And the tendency of movements to be articulated more and more in how space can be used and how we define what use is, which I didn't get a chance to dig into this, but I think it's really interesting going back to like the old circle text around like Agamben and the concept of use there, and like kind of what that means in terms of like space. So all this stuff gets organized by Lefebvre into this diagram on the right. I drew the diagram, but this is how he maps it out, which is that the state introduces an extra level of subordination, and becomes the agent of that extra level, which is you have the simple reproduction of the labor force, which is dominated by relations of production, which we already see in the logic of reproduction at the end of volume 1. But now this is in turn mapped, and like the relations of production are, at least according to Lefebvre, subordinate to the relations of domination. And these relations of domination are themselves apt for being incorporated into space in a way that the earlier relations of production aren't. And what that aptness looks like in practice is everydayness, spatiality, and repetitiveness. Everydayness is the way that time and space, like time gets programmed in space, the way that, whether it's clocks or traffic stuff. And I don't really know enough about urban planning to know like details of this, but like all the ways that like the needs to keep a punctual society are organized into the streamlining of transportation, communication, etc. Spatiality, center periphery relations, and we've talked about this a lot in this group, so I think we can go. Though I think one thing that's important about Lefebvre, and one thing I've been thinking a lot about in terms of how this stuff applies to an analysis of the United States, is one of the ways that I think the settler colonial aspects of the United States and white supremacist various forms of segregation have really, like, the United States has excelled at like maintaining peripheries within the domestic space in a kind of way that I think is part and parcel of why it's so effective at being everything US is. So I do think like Lefebvre gives us a kind of like fractal notion of center periphery. I'm not saying the other theories don't, but I think he has that there. That's really interesting. And then repetitiveness, right? That the identical is reproduced and differences are abolished. And this is a constant like refrain of his, that there's difference itself is constantly being targeted by state homogenization, right? And it's not some abstract kind of like sameness. It's like a very particular program of the state that has to do with the way the state needs to coordinate itself in space, right? So I think it has a similarity to a lot of other kind of ideas that are contemporaneous around like sameness and difference and whatnot, but it's, I think, much more specific and therefore I think much more useful in terms of like political strategy and whatnot. And
Can
that
you
was
repeat really quick? I might have missed it. Mental space, is this like abstractions that the state makes? Like, I mean, like patriotism, something I'm thinking of.
patriotism.
Or what would you say?
I would, like, from the way he described it, I think it's in a certain kind of way, it's literally the way that people picture how the state works in their head.
Okay.
Which often like is not at all
Mhm,
congruent with how
mhm.
the state actually works, but the state manages a certain kind of diagram of itself
Sure.
that serves purposes, right?
I see. Okay. Yeah.
And so, for example, like the state has an interest in business owners having a sufficiently effective diagram to know where to go in order to like plug in with the right people to get their business working, right? But you
Mhm.
don't necessarily want workers or average people to have that same diagram, right? So there's an actual kind of technocratic, and this is stuff that's come out of like activist experience, which I'll get into later, when business
Sure.
owners and city managers really don't like when these mental maps get made public, if you will, right? So there's but it's much more like almost like like an application program interface. Like when you go look at an API for something, it's like that, and who gets to see that?
That makes sense.
But of course, it also dovetails with the kind of more traditional ideological picture of nationalism. And of course, it gets like super complex in how it maps out. But I think for Lefebvre, it's more a diagram of how it all maps rather than like a picture of what an idealized country should be.
Okay.
So this was where I was going to put some of the interesting first attempts that Lefebvre did before we get to here. But Lefebvre used subject-object paradigms and he used linguistic tools to try to get at different ways to understand this space. And he ultimately settled on these two complementary, though he argued that the left historic genetic precedes hierarchically stratified morphology in understanding the state. Now, in the latter, I do, it's interesting because actually, Gabriel, you brought up the guy who I'm now going blank on, Cartan student. This guy, the Tom. He's the guy that came up with hierarchically stratified morphology. Tom is the guy that Lefebvre quotes in here. And I honestly, this is one of those places where I don't know enough of the mathematics to know if he's kind of taking how literal this can be applied.
René Thom, the guy, the French fellow.
Yeah. The student of Cartan, the catastrophe spaces.
Okay.
All
that.
that.
Cartan, I thought Caratani, but it's Cartani. It's a mixture of Cartan and Caratani.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, it's a René Thom, I think.
Yeah.
So a court, like for Lefebvre's reading, the homogenization and fragmentation, especially those two, kind of like come out of his reading of tome, which is as you have this process of homogenization through kind of like creating these morphological, you know, these links, these like hierarchically organized links, that very process also develops the space of catastrophe, right? And that space of catastrophe is linked to the way fragmentation occurs, and the constant attempt to offset that is hierarchicization, which I still don't know if there's technically an arrow going from hierarchically stratified morphology to hierarchization. Lefebvre is kind of ambivalent. Sometimes he puts these as all three, sometimes he makes it just those two. So I don't know if anyone here actually knows enough about tome to weigh in on this, but this is how Lefebvre utilizes him. So I'll just give a moment there to see if anyone has anything.
I think that, I mean, we can talk about this later, but because there is something interesting about Lefebvre, which is, I think he's, from the Marxists that I know of, the one that was most kind of concerned with theorizing about layers and different scales in space. So his concept of space is very stratified and very rich. And I feel like one of the things, I think even Toscano mentions this in the text, which is, it's weird how Lefebvre can be at the same time arguing for the idea that the contemporary state produces an unbelievable kind of level of homogenization, but at the same time, he's always talking about this sort of fragmentization of the space. So it's not really like everything is uniform and everything is the same. It's not the sort of cheap idea of homogenization, but it seems contradictory, right? Because on the one hand, things become more homogenized. On the other, this allows spaces to be more fragmented. So how can these two things be, right? And I think that from what I understand, he takes insights from René Thom's work on attractors and sort of how forms can emerge in this sort of non-linear systems and things like this. So morphogenetic theories to talk about the connection between a lot of fragmentation on one level leading to the establishment of homogeneity on another level, right? But well, we can talk about this later. I just have the impression sometimes that what Lefebvre is really interested in is that the space that you can no longer differentiate on the same level what is production, what is consumption, or circulation, as if they are regions of space, but rather, for example, I mean, we were talking about Ludmila Bilio before and this sort of Uberization processes. It seems like, and Toscano talks about this in his text as well, it seems almost like a productive unit is actually a weird kind of connection of parts of space, become a big productive object. But it's not just one part of reality. It's a slightly larger point of view you need to adopt. So aspects that were common to only be found within production, some forms of kind of monovalent, like univalent spaces, only have one function, right? They're made to function only to transport the commodity, for example. Those things get expanded outside of the productive space, and the seed itself starts mimicking aspects that were supposed to be productive, while for us it remains heterogeneous and fragmented, almost like an alien kind of infrastructure on an urban space. From a different perspective, it made that space more homogeneous, right? So it's weird that things can be more fragmented, more heterogeneous, because they're becoming more homogeneous, and that homogeneity is also weirdly indifferent to that heterogeneity, right? So it's a weird kind of mixture of those two things that you get in his theory. It's not like everything looks the same, of course not, right? So I think that that's kind of where René Thom comes into the picture. Like, what tools do we have to imagine how increased heterogenization and increased homogenization might not be conflicting diagnoses, but part of the same diagnosis, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So coming from that, what that particular dynamic that Gabriel just mapped out is the product of the left-hand column, in the sense that that is the outcome of the historical genetic movement. Those, all the categories basically correspond to a mode of production in the classic scheme, analogic to, you know, pre-class societies, cosmological to the classic Greco-Roman kind of states, symbolic to the feudal, perspectival to Renaissance, and then capitalistic space. He makes a point that they shouldn't be reduced, but he does make that kind of like chain. So there's a lot that goes on there. And in particular, he differentiates these two levels, which is spatial analysis itself, like the actual arrangement and the layouts, but then rhythm analysis, which I think kind of jives a lot with the analysis of song and labor and stuff that happen in the compositional point of view talk. So there's like dimensions there that aren't in the traditional analysis of mode of productions that have to be there. But he has a quote that I forgot to write down, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it real quick from the text. That has to do with the step between the perspectival and the capitalistic space, and where he really mobilizes René Thom's ideas of catastrophe space. So here's the quote. Theory shows that from a genetic perspective, the conditions for stability and the conditions for a rupture are produced simultaneously. Perspectival space was produced historically through economic, social, and political factors, but it cannot be reduced to these factors. It has its space of catastrophe, logistical space. So for Lefebvre, it's when space becomes rigorously geometrized and organized under perspectival space that a certain formal relationship to space emerges that then shifts from the kind of aesthetic and also collective living standard that was at least in principle there for the humanism of the Renaissance to this inhuman, cold logic of the logistical state and the logistical space. But still from within, and I think like your point, Gabriel, is really interesting here. It's still a perspectival space, but no longer from the perspective of the human. It's from the perspective of capital that it is organized, and to a certain extent from the capital state, that it is now makes sense. The city makes sense on a logistical perspective that is now fragmented for the inhabitants of the city. And that's
why I thought that he shouldn't have called it the state mode of production, because that's going to create like some I mean, he's not a stupid guy. He doesn't think like the state runs everything now. I think he should have called it the scalar mode of production. He could have kept the acronym, you know, but just be perhaps a bit more to the point if he had said that, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I also don't like the title. And I think honestly, I haven't had a chance to think about how the naming would go, but I do think the whole kind of dislodging from production to exchange also has some opportunities, because I don't even know if the state's relationship is primarily to production, if not to a larger concept of exchange and intercourse. So there's a lot there in the name that's like weird.
Yeah, I don't want to get too bogged down in it, but yeah.
So yeah, so basically the historical genetic side on the left gives us the kind of like viewpoint to see how these abstract moments of homogenization and fragmentation emerge and how hierarchicization comes out of that. And this leads us to the regulatory character of political space and state space. And there are different dimensions, the ideological technocratic. And I think this goes back to your question, Yasha, around mental representation. The ideological technocratic representation of the social is simultaneously managing, you know, patriotism and a certain, you know, in case a lot of my focus is on studying the United States. So it's like managing a certain notion of like the liberatory character of the United States, but also when people think about like the three wings of government and think about like what is the Supreme Court supposed to do, and a great example of the kind of clash between these very particular diagrams and patriotism with reality, I think, are the Russiagate trials that were held. People had this idea of how the intelligence community operates and how it's supposed to function, and it was running into like, and the exploitation that like Putin and whatnot are able to do is like, Putin knows damn well what the CIA actually does. He doesn't have to lie about what the CIA actually does. So so these representations of the social that are actually how people maneuver through society, how they make like decisions in relationship to the state. So when that gets like cracked or threatened in a situation like what's happened under years of Trump, like you see a lot of people's very weird reactions. The practical instrumental, this also like builds directly off of the first one, because this is actually how you negotiate and do things, right? And having a mental map is a part and parcel of the cognitive mapping component of a larger, how is space organized so you can use it, whether that's road signs or the way that like zoning laws operate or whatever. And then the last is the tactical strategic. And he doesn't have his general, he says it principally has to do with resources, right? And subordinating a territory's resources. But I think it's like, it is important, I think, to pull that out, because you see, for example, in the United States, like the attitude the state had towards the water protectors around the Dakota Access Pipeline was much more, quote, tactical strategic. I mean, like there's been a lot of militarized responses recently, but that was one of the sharp escalations, and the treatment that people had and the rationalization by the state around it because of having to do with resources was different than when it tries to control populations in the urban, you know, with like Black Lives Matter or whatnot. And these all have, so that's kind of the general regulatory character, but then those all connect to the third aspect of the state, because the state, the third aspect, hierarchization, comes out of these processes we've already been talking about, homogenization and fragmentation. It is the ongoing kind of reaction formation to those two things constantly driving each other and also being in conflict with each other. And these are very like practical things. What are the methods of hierarchization? You break up opposition, you distribute groups of people, and including opposition groups into ghettos. You know, you either separate people or you put them together, knowing that it's going to increase conflict. And Lefebvre defines ghetto all the way up to like gated communities of the bourgeois. Like for him, ghetto is the way people live under the state mode of production. And that goes to number two. You hierarchize places on the basis of power relations. Whether that's the particularly like austere presentation that a military facility has compared to everything else in domestic space, or if that's like the gated community with security guards versus like a trailer park or a favela or whatever, right? Like the actual ways that these are distributed and the differing ways, therefore, that they're policed, monitored, surveilled. And then, and I thought this was interesting, and I think it kind of relates back to your point about Lefebvre and scales, Gabriel, is there's a third moment of control the entire system. Like you can't just look at things in terms of locale. You have to be able to zoom out, which has to go back to that diagram I showed in the beginning, in order to really assess how the whole thing is working. If you don't have a place conceptually, but also institutionally to zoom out too, you can never really get a sovereign perspective on the situation of this homogenization and fragmentation, and how effective your hierarchization is doing. So that's the first fellow, that's Lefebvre. Actually, before we go into the next guy, are there any questions, thoughts, critique, anything where we're at so far?
Yeah, I mean, he sounds so primer-y, like the whole idea of relating state and space in such a strong way sounds very useful to me. Can you just go back to the diagram, just make sure I understand like so much stuff. Like the historical, just to see if I'm following, like the historical generic stuff, the spatial and the rhythmic is like time and space, right?
Yeah, and I should point out, those are like, I wanted to get different arrows, but I ran out of time. Those are two different aspects of the method, where the bottom are like the outcomes of the research, right? So that's a little vague. Sorry about that.
But then how do, I mean, perspectival means just like what you construct from an embedded specific point of view, is that it?
Well, specifically it talks about Renaissance perspectivalism, right? The art and the like, but more importantly than the art, I think for him was the urban design. And how space was abstracted in that design, but it was within the perspective of a humanism, but that abstraction and the capacity to do so was then kind of tool for logistical space. And for him, that's what he calls the catastrophe space of the Renaissance era, is the logistical perspective, or the logistical space, I should say. Sorry.
So there is a distinction, like a periodization between state space built from this sort of humanist perspective, like even like just vaguely, like the lines of things point towards the human perspective, versus the logistical space, where the sort of geometry of space is not really made with the human in the center, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And this is where he invokes Tome, saying that like perspectival has to do with like the morphology or the stratification, and then the capitalistic space, or the logistical space is the quote space of catastrophe. And that's where like I don't know, like it seems like a pretty important conceptual moment, and I don't really know the mathematics to see if it's appropriate or not or whatever, but like that's the conceptual frame he uses to connect the two.
I don't know what mathematics is in here. Yeah. Specifically, but
it has like
it's I will say it's interesting though that he seems to frame logistical space purely negatively, right? Or no?
Yeah, that's part of
or at least purely like intertwined with capital.
Yes, the entire text state and space is the state mode of production, and part of what I'm trying to do is abstract from that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. This is all very much embedded within capitalism, and looking at the state as interested in the reproduction of capitalism, even if it's not kind of subordinated fully to the logic of capitalism.
Yeah, because I mean, this is one thing that I really wanted to understand better, because the hypothesis, this sort of contemporary hypothesis, that the crucial dimension of contemporary state is the sort of logistics, and that it comes with this weird form of producing space, right? Which is weirdly indifferent. I mean, I think we mentioned this idea of like containers and this sort of clear shaping of the world through real abstractions that are more well conformed to capitalist social forms than to human use of these things and so on, right? Or even to ritualistic, symbolic kind of things, right? One of the things that I find very hard about this theory, I really, not hard in the sense that it doesn't make sense to me, but it's a challenge, which is to reconstruct a continuity from theses concerning sovereignty and concerning state power, where, let's say, state power insofar as it is, let's say, made with the human in the middle, right? It can vastly exceed human power, but you still have this idea that, well, when you're lost, you should look at some positive figure or the empty seat of a positive figure, and that will kind of give you the map of the whole, right? I see that in classic state theory or early modern state theory, you have this sovereign problem, and you have a strong problem with issues of property and ultimately of resources. I mean, for Karatani, the logic of the state is the logic of plunder, right? So it is a logic of how do you direct resources? And
yeah, absolutely.
And violence is more a means than an end in that discussion, right?
Yeah, that's part of where I've shifted from the last presentation, is try to start from a more abstract moment from plunder and get to plunder rather than start as like a substantial moment. So,
but then the difficult part for me is that I can see the connection between these different realms, like the juridical and property, the sovereign and the sort of representation of a totality, and the sort of material dimension of resources. But it's hard to envision the passage from this configuration, which I think, if I understood what respectable means, looks to me that at least for early capitalist situations or the development of capitalism, it still struggled between this sort of impersonal point of view of capital, where commodities make their own contracts, let's say, and the state, where humans are supposed to make contracts and struggle for resources or whatever. So this logistical space, which suddenly seems to finally fit, like finally acquiesce to be informed by capitalist relations, where it's suddenly resource, like logistic would be resources for capital, not resources between humans, right? We go along, but logistics are not, let's say, invading a human space. Suddenly, inside a human city made for people, there is also some infrastructure. On the contrary, you have infrastructure with people living on top, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And you see that very clearly with the Mongols, for sure.
Yeah, so I have a hard time kind of tracking that transformation with all these different elements, the logistic aspect seems to be very useful to think about, let's say, a sort of lost battle of the state against the sort of abstract domination of capital circulation, and then it kind of acquiesces to the sort of, it takes on some forms that are even more appropriate for capitalist circulation and closes very far distances and creates big gaps in accordance to the circulation of commodities, to diminishing the circulation time and the realization time of surplus value and things like this. But it's hard to track how the other aspects of sort of contract logic or the state classical theory, the state follow this, right? I might be getting ahead of myself, but it seems that for Lefebvre, they also get kind of further decentralized, right? I mean, the way
Absolutely,
that
he makes, and Toscano quotes, talks about it too, is they get decentralized and dispersed. And that's something I come back to later when I analyze federalism in the United States, like how you can have both logistical centralization and dispersion of, like, for lack of a better word, power relations.
Okay. So there's that too, yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. So,
but I just wanted to kind of see if I'm going the same page.
No. And I think that is like, I think just to kind of come into a few things there. First off, like, I'm still not like the word resource. I'm open to a better word. It's the best starting word. But if we're going to follow the objective phenomenological wager, like, we're trying to look how resources appear to one another, and how, like, things appear in that space.
I think a good way to frame that issue, which is the problem with resource, is that it's not clearly a matter of property, right? It is obviously, I mean, there's a small gap, right, between resource. Resource seems like it's property for use, right? Perhaps like where we have use value, we have resource theory, right? And where we have exchange value, we have property theory. Like, the property aspect is who has it and what are the conditions for alienation. Whereas
That's a good way of putting it.
The standpoint of resource, like treating a good as a resource, is more like, where does it go, right? It's more functional.
No, I totally agree.
So there is a connection there, but it's a nice thing to develop. It's. I mean, I don't have clear intuitions on it. It's really interesting.
Any other comments before we go on?
I think waste is another good angle to approach.
Oh, very good point. Yeah, waste is something. Yeah, and I think Karatani is great on that, and I haven't worked that in at all. So,
but why would you put waste on the state level, like, and not on? Why would there be like commodity waste and property waste?
Like, if you look at like the cost function from Levere and whatnot, like, part of the definition of a corporation is it can literally, like, make waste not appear, and it's the state that has to deal with the negative externalities, right? It's the state that literally manages landfills, handles garbage. Like, these are the things.
Or at least pays for it.
Yeah, at least in your state.
In our states.
But it's like, that's part of the, I guess, interesting way to one interesting way to kind of examine neoliberalism in terms of this perspective is the failure of corporations to try to take over aspects of TV. But there's still kind of things that I think come up within state spatialization originally. I don't know if you had different thoughts on that, Dennis.
Yeah, I mean, along those lines, just the fact that waste is supposed to disappear and the logistical machinery does that, but then this idea of catastrophe is when the waste comes back, right? Something in that
garbage island. Yeah,
garbage island. Oil spills. Just all that stuff is just like the externality returning in a different form, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think that's a really good point, because in the next part we're going to look at kind of like a logic of a breakdown to complement this more.
Yeah, I think this action of like disappearance of waste example, I think is a good example of like a sort of like horizontal movement through like whatever the multi-layered transcendental or whatever we want to say versus like a vertical movement too, right? So it doesn't appear to certain people, but then it still is included within something else, some other system. It's dealt by the state and it has effects on the natural environment, so on and so on, and can appear in different ways later.
Yeah, I mean, for example, just taking a concrete example, like you get problems with waste.
I'll be right back.
Sure. Like you get problems with waste in Europe today, like there's no place to dispose of certain types of waste. So they just enclose it in a commodity form, like a fictive commodity, like as if it was land, and they sell it, and Brazil buys it. We buy, I don't know how many tons of waste per month, so that people can, we dispose of it in our land and get some money for it.
I see.
So, I mean, I would put the state there in terms of, property relations that allow for waste to become a commodity, even if it's not, it's not going to become repurposed, like recycled. It's just going to be buried, but it's going to be buried elsewhere.
Yeah.
Right? So it is a logic of resources. It touches on geopolitics. So it shows that these things are connected: territory, logistics. But again, ultimately, it's submitted to the commodity form. Like they only manage to do it because somebody's buying. Even though there is a funny story, not so funny, about 5 years ago, a ship, an unmarked ship, docked in a port here in Brazil, in Santos, with I don't know how many tons of garbage. Like a country just sent a ship and docked it here, and the crew flew like
That's so rude.
And then we found out it was England that they did it.
Of course.
Yeah, so like this is the level of respect Brazil gets in international politics today. Like, yeah, just put it in their door and run away.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah, this is us.
On behalf of the rest of the world, I'm sorry.
I always dream of a Brazilian sci-fi movie that would be like this. Like we are mono agricultural. Most like we have huge plantations of one thing, right? That we sell mostly to China these days. But I thought of in the future we might just stop being an agrarian society, like having so much agriculture, and we just substitute it for huge landfills where we take in the garbage of the world. That could be a Brazilian dystopia. I can see that.
It's like Meteor City from Hunter x Hunter, if anyone knows that.
I don't, but I feel like I will soon.
All right. Well, on that note, let's go on.
Does the more biopolitical dimension of the state, like controlling populations, does that also fits within this logistical point of view?
Yeah, that's really going to come up again with the Mongols.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's part of what is so blunt in the case of the Mongol Empire is like, in a way, they were biopolitical avant la lettre. Like they very explicitly treated populations and territories in a way that is reminiscent of like Foucault's analysis, and treating bodies as like parts of a larger logistical structure, to the point of like innovating quite a few nasty warfare strategies around it, which we'll get into. So,
but
yeah,
just to complement Renzo's question, I think that part of what Lefebvre is trying to do also is to show that some theories of power, just like some theories of capitalist control, sometimes they they have a hard time spelling out how the real abstractions can shape a form of domination without the need of a controller, right? So I think a lot of his work is also directed to the idea that, well, if you just shape the urban space in certain ways, if the routes of transportation are shaped in some form, if they divide the city in some ways, that's already the biopolitical at play. Sometimes you don't need to focus so much on the police, for example, as a sort of active reinforcer of segregation. These things can be informed into space very much in the way that they are informed into price structures and things like that, right? So there's a strong biopolitical kind of vibe, but it's also more like it's like a geometry of biopolitics rather than an agent-based discussion of biopolitics, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think it kind of it raises a question of kind of like whether or not biopolitics is a particular moment in history versus like a way of organizing and looking at things that's more generic. So we'll get to that in a bit. So thanks to again Gabriel, who's provided a lot of the nuts and bolts of this presentation. He recommended in my last presentation looking at the logic of determination and dependency, which I've only got my hand on the text a few days ago. So this last bit is recently added, but it fits in very nicely. Accepting some abusive notation.
Did you like the guy? It's a nice text.
That's a brilliant essay. That's what I think that's actually one of the best examples of like a post-Heideggerian phenomenology I've read. It's like so succinct and clear. And I'll share it, or if you want to share it, Gabriel. It's like a super nice piece, and it lays out the problem very clearly.
Yeah, I think Caron would like it as well. We have some Wittgenstein vibes to it.
Yeah. There's a really good reference to Wittgenstein and Ryle and some interesting, and I think a really good example of like using analytic logic and philosophy in a way that jives with our project.
Yeah, he was a really famous mathematician.
It's like 9 pages too, so it's accessible. Yeah. It's not mathematical. In fact, what I have here on the table is what he literally says, like, this is my formal replacement for like a mathematical proof. And he says a system of analogies can be as rigorous as a formal proof. So according to Rhoda, this is kind of like where we're at least where he's at with a proof of the existence of a Fundirum relationship. So what is Fundirum? It is an attempt to capture the way something can be dependent on something else without being determined by it. In fact, it is the locus of determination. And those levels are divided in these like 2 arrows. That you have the system of determination that is a function which is relevant to the context and is dependent on a support, which is the facticity, which is irrelevant to the context, but is independent, or he used the German word unselbständig and selbstständig, which means standing or self-standing or not self-standing. And so the examples are really a good place to start because that's his proof, right? So he describes functions and facticities. He also calls facticities processes. And so you read a text, but you can learn the same content from a bunch of different texts. The content of a text is not reducible to a text. The social role of a person, whether they're a lawyer or a mother or a politician, is dependent on a person being a person, but that the functions come from the social roles. A pen, he says, we tend to think of a pen as an object, but we should actually think of a pen as a function that is dependent on a number of facticities, ink, metal, plastic, etc. We see things, which is the facticity, but that supports viewing, which is actually what enables us to extract the relevant content and to draw the determinations on which we make assessments. And then the rules of a card game like bridge, and he talks about the Queen of Hearts. The meaning of the Queen of Hearts is determined not by like the composition of the deck of cards, but by the rules of bridge, which, however, depend upon an existing deck of cards with an existing set of symbols.
Can I ask if this is something like a lambda calculus, like gives off that kind of vibe?
It really does. And I think, honestly, his actual definition of Fundirum, from what little bit I understand of it, reminds me a lot of a monad.
Yeah, exactly.
So he describes it in these terms. I'll just read these real quick. Fundirum is a relationship, one of whose terms is a function. The content of the text is a function. The function is related to the text by a Fundirum relation. The other term of Fundirum relation we call the facticity. In the first example, the text. In the second example, the Queen of Hearts as a mere card in the deck. Facticity plays a supporting role to function. Only the function is relevant. The text is the facticity that lets the content function is relevant. We shall say for short that the content of the letter is factically related, or that it bears a long German word, to the text. Fundirum is a primitive logical relation. And this is where I particularly abuse the notation later on, but there we go. One that can in no way be reduced to simpler, let alone to a material relation. Confusing function with facticity in a Fundirum relation is an instance of reduction. And I think this is a really good and useful definition. An error in reasoning as common as or more common than a petitio principii or ignoratio elenchi. Facticity is the essential support, selbstständig, but it is meant not to upstage the function it founds. The point is that there's no single what we necessarily see while watching four people around a table or while watching anything. All what's whatsoever are functions in Fundirum relations. All what's are by the grace of some Fundirum relation whose context dependence, and again, this is very monadic, whose context dependence cannot be shoved under the rug. The context dependence of Fundirum is taken by the reductionist for arbitrariness, but this is a mistake. The rules of bridge are dependent upon the context of the game of bridge, but they are in no way arbitrary. So yeah, I mean, like it seems so much like lambda calculus and typing and monads that it's phenomenal. It's great because it fits in with a lot of the other constructions that have been coming up in this. And so I went ahead and formalized it. Let F be a function and phi a facticity. Let Fundirum, big F of F is a Fundirum relationship. And I don't go any deeper than that because I don't know how, but I just wanted to do that. So Rota brings up 5 issues. The other 3 are interesting, but I'd say they're more generic issues of any logic. But there are 2 particular, the first 2 I think are very particular to the Fundirum relationship. And the first one actually ties directly back into, well, both of them tie directly back into Lefebvre, because the first has to do with the kind of hierarchical morphology that provides the kind of structuring for the spatialization of the state in Lefebvre's theory, which is, Rota says you can have like, let's say you receive a letter of confession from someone. The confessional meaning is a function that is dependent upon the facticity of the content, but that content is in turn a function of the facticity of reading, which is itself a function of the facticity of the text. So you have in between the top function and the bottom facticity, these 2 levels where you have 2 things. Function is both facticity and function, right? They operate as both facticity and function. And he's very explicit, like, how does this work? You know, he's not giving an answer, he's saying this is a problem we have to clarify. And that's also a problem I'm asking when I'm reading Lefebvre's, how does this work? So we have a logical formulation, which goes well because in Lefebvre, he's constantly talking about the logic of logistics and the way logic maps onto logistics, to the point that I actually find somewhat problematic, because he talks about like logic is inherently violent and logic is inherently linked to the state. So I think now what's interesting, and I just want to jump ahead for a bit, is because logic, I think that he had access to, especially, and was familiar with, where there, you know, binarity is still dominant within logic, and our kind of wager is that the state has a privileged relationship to binarity. It would appear that logic, as it's traditionally been conceived, does have a privileged relationship to the state. But I think that this idea of pair consistency on TA and intuitive logic fuzzy sets on TC shows that logic has a much broader scope, but that there's a reason it would kind of like appear that way. So I think there's some interesting stuff there. But even without the state, this problem of hierarchy and embeddedness and the way these things connect, and it directly then has to bear on the second problem, which is whenever the relevant function functions as it is meant to function, the underlying facticities are not thematized. They are unobtrusive. In playing a bridge game, the material composition of the cards is irrelevant if the cards are properly made. Facticity is thematized in a breakdown. How does such a change of view appear? This right here, I mean, that just the change of view, and like it fits so well into the way things are like being articulated in the research here. I don't know how I did that, but okay. So you know, these problems that you have with Lefebvre in his language of like the hierarchization of space and the way that space can be homogenized through building hierarchies, and that in turn, that very process produces the conditions that when a breakdown occurs, it occurs coming the change in view is influenced by what it's changing from, by the functioning, right? So the functioning leads to a dysfunction which this facticity appears on. And so there's a lot of kind of like parallels between how Lefebvre describes the logic of logistical space and how Rota describes this particular logic, which is why it is so compelling. I completely agree with Gabriel that it has a very powerful modeling capacity for these issues. So the next slide is where I'm actually going to make my case. So I just wanted to, again, stop here. I know you've worked with Rota before, Gabriel. So if you had any comments or thoughts, anyone on this or questions, wanted to check.
The thing that I mean, I was just thinking about, it's pure free association, but you know, it's two things that I was trying to connect before, and I think that this actually adds to it. A long time ago, Renzo shared a presentation on a totally different topic, which was the issue of how we can imagine consciousness, like very basic conscious operations allow us to discern the structure of color. And it's a really good presentation. I forget the name of that guy. Remember, Renzo, what's the guy's name?
Andrew Hahn.
Yeah, Hahn. And there was something I remember was talking to Renzo about, which was the impression that there was some threshold at stake. Like, why do you perceive space? Okay. Sorry?
No, that was a problem. I'm looking for the video. Yeah.
Yeah. Like there is a distinction that the guy draw. This presentation is amazing. I really suggest people who haven't seen Renzo's presentation look at it and then see this presentation as well. But the guy makes this distinction between, like, he's trying to construct an explanation of why integrated information theory is the best model for how we can move from a sort of network of relations of the brain to the properties of space. And let's say the idea of having the awareness of a spatiality, right? And he distinguishes this, which is a sort of positional spatial structure, from the problem of color, which seems to be weirdly unlocalized, right? Weirdly, like it's a classic issue of the qualia, of quality, because it seems not to come with any inner structure, right? You don't discern things inside of it. When you see red, it's red, right? And one of the things that looked very promising, the way he presented and then talking to Renzo, was to think about a certain threshold of structures that are below, let's say, the proper grain or the proper resolution for the coherence of that system. So the partitions of that system that are relevant, they don't make relevant the inner structure of color. So they are below a certain resolution, and that's why they appear to be structureless, right? So qualia would be something like again, this is total crazy batshit things I'm saying here. They have no bearing on anything real. But the intuition that the presentation gave me was that, well, perhaps we should think about quality in this sort of substantial, a-structured way as an effect of things that are below the level of analysis, the contextual level of analysis, but they still have effects. Okay, so you start getting that feel. Things become a feel, a vibe, or a sort of structuralist substance that seems like a given, not because they are inherently a-structured, but because the level at which you should be grasping it in order to capture some inner structure is not coherent with the level that you're actually constructing something at that point. So why is this relevant? Because the Fundirum concept, the place where it first appears, is in Russell's logical idea. I forgot the title of the fucking book. It's not Meditations, it's the Logical Investigations, I think it's called. I forget how it's called. It's like 3 volumes, right? And the context is, how do you describe the relation between color and space? When you imagine color, you necessarily imagine space, right? Color needs to be in space. You, even like mentally, you need a blob, right? And a blob takes up some extension. But the extension has no power over the blob of color, right? The logic of color is not dependent, it's not determined by spatiality. You can have infinite red space or one point, which is red, right? But it is dependent. Without space, you cannot imagine color, right? So that's like his initial phenomenological insight, that there is some operation you need to account for what he calls non-independent parts. So color is a non-independent part of space because it requires to be imagined as part of something else, but that something else doesn't have power of determining color.
Well, I mean, with this specific example, isn't color even more literally spatial? I mean, like if you think of it from like on the level of like optics and physics, like a color of a surface is determined by how the light bounces off of it, right? Which is determined by spatial properties on the microscopic level. They're below our resolution that we can see. Yeah.
Exactly, but you had to move to the microscopic resolution, which we don't see.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, so that's the whole point. Like Russell was trying to think phenomenology from our perspective, and that kind of implies a cutoff, a threshold, that you go beyond the limit at which you could see the structure that clarifies why color and space are not related in this weird Fundirum relation, but they are actually more entangled in a material sense. So this is two pieces of the puzzle. So first is the qualia problem in Renzo's and IET, Renzo's presentation and Hans' presentation. Then there is this Fundirum idea with color. Sorry, somebody's really busy. And then there's a third point, which is facticity, right? Refers back to facts. And in our kind of framework, there is a theory of what a fact is. There is like a specific page there in the current go-to reference, which is Logics of Worlds, on what is a fact. And a fact is precisely defined as something that emerges in a site, so something singular that appears kind of almost from below the atomic level. So it's not functional in the space. It's not part of the context. It's below the context. For example, you're hearing a pretty soprano singing, or you're hearing somebody play an instrument, and you hear something about the timbre of the instrument. That specific instrument. It's like it's a bit out of tune. It's not getting in the way, or the singer has a bit of a coarser, rougher tone in their voice. It's not changing the song. It's probably too subtle to change any of the meaning of the song or the feeling of it, but it's just below the context, right? It's very close to the context, but below it, and it's not really bringing any added structure, right? But it's, so even in that theory of let's say subatomic facts, which is how kind of we get it in Badiou, right? This sort of appearance of something which is below the level of function, of functionality, of parts of the world that are coherent with one another, but something that is slightly below it. It also comes close to this idea of facticity, I think, right?
Also, I mean, that perspective, if it's alone would like, I guess like privilege looking at things sort of like from below, right? So I guess it depends what you want in whatever context, right? Like for Natal in physics, he would not want to do that, but.
Yeah, exactly. Natal wants to actually go beyond, like physically, he wants to extract that information, right? It's relevant.
Are there like facts in this way that come from the other way, going to like a higher scale, but projecting down?
It's a
Are there
good
examples
question.
you can think of something like that?
Yeah, it's a good question, right?
Because that also seems to be interesting.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, ultimately from the logics of worlds perspective, facts are singular in the sense that they are indexing a function on something that does not repeat. But that thing that does not repeat doesn't get to change the function, right? So you will say something like that. Yes, there was a policeman in front of my door. So there is some singular spatial, temporal, personal reference. But the fact that there was one guy there doesn't change the fact that what counts is the functional, the policeman, my door. Those are functional descriptions, right? So I don't know, all of these seem to kind of brings us closer to this idea that facticity and function, they do play a, like, it seems like what's at stake is always a way of mobilizing, to use the word that we are trying to push, right? Mobilize a resource from the situation that is not functionally active, right? You have nothing to say about the deck of cards. The deck of cards is not a relevant part of the world beyond the fact that it's caught up in a certain logical space, right? But nevertheless, it's just below the threshold, right? It's very close to it. You still can make statements about this, let's say, fringe or this foundational relation, right, between the functional status of that part of the world and the thing that it's supporting, right? Anyway, I'm ranting about
also
many things I don't understand at the same time. So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, at my point that I was actually saying, now that I'm thinking about it, this perspective of defining facts might always have to be from below, because that might have to be a subset of the site, right?
yeah, it's a good. I mean, the problem is that nothing prevents you having sites on real big objects, right? You can define really huge objects and then define parts of huge objects that are atomic, and they will be huge atoms. Why not, right? I mean, it's not like the bottom and the top in this approach is not so kind of small versus big, right? But I agree with you. It's easier to think about singularity and facts by pointing downwards than by pointing upwards, right?
Yeah.
Which even makes the idea of a total social fact, which is a classic kind of theme in sociology, also something to think about. Yeah, but I just wanted to mention that I think Hotta contributes to that discussion also, you know, this very kind of limiting place between finding material support, right, which is a dimension of what we've been calling atomic logic, having this material support, and the fact that that material support comes into play as facts, meaning merely as indifferent substrates to something logical, right? John, are you okay? I feel like John's having a bit of a moment.
Yeah, let's hope everything is all right with him.
While we're waiting for him, can we apply this to the? I mean, it seems like we can apply this to the distinction between labor and labor power, right? In a sense.
Yeah.
This. Yeah, you have the fact of labor, the function of labor power, kind of built on top of that. But
I think that's right.
The fact that it's interchangeable labor, right? It's not Joe's labor or Steve's labor. It's generic labor time, like general labor time that you can kind of swap out the parts, but still achieve the same function. And then the whole appearance of surplus value is like a short circuit between fact and function.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea that we should think about fact and function as both being logical terms. Like, I think Hotta makes it seem like facts are outside of the logical space, but it's like you actually distribute the two. Like, the fact will just be that part of the world that is incapable of determining. It's formed rather than form giving, right? It gives the matter, but not the form. So it's still logical because as Yasha was saying, well, nothing prevents you from going further into the analysis of color and recognizing its inner structure, right? The question is at a certain level of presentation, what looks like it's functional and what looks like it's just factual changes, right? Depending on the level. And just to, sorry, John, just, are you okay, John? I thought you were having a bit of.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, sorry, I had a little unwell, so I just had to go to the bathroom, but I'm good.
You're okay.
Yeah.
The only thing I was going to mention is this sentence here, which I think is the most important one, where it says, in playing a bridge game, the material composition of the cards is irrelevant if the cards are properly made, right? So facts, like facticity being like fully obtaining for this function, where it is the thing that supports, that is materially grounded but doesn't determine, that only works under certain conditions if the cards are properly made, right? Which I think is a crucial part for this whole logistical space discussion, because the whole point is to create a space that is properly made. It's really informed by sort of lineaments, right? As Toscano says, that are, let's say, coherent with real abstraction, so that they don't get in the way. And then they function as a sort of facticity, right? They function like you're writing something down, in a way. Sorry.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think actually that everything you just brought up, Gabriel, I think it was really interesting to then kind of ask about, going back to the whole question of mental representation, the way that like different things for the state, like in different diagrams, kind of when a resource appears, when an institution appears, when a group of people appears. And this comes up a lot, I think, in the branch of mathematics that in its name is most linked to the state, like statistics. When you're generating the abstract categories, and that's something, again, that we'll see in the Mongol Empire. They loved and utilized statistics, all the most advanced methods of their time, to try to create, I think, in a lot of ways, like a way to look at different facts in different sites, because they have this massive empire. How do you look at a fact in Central Asia and a fact in China and a fact in Baghdad? You have to have an incredibly sophisticated, like, abstract apparatus, right? So yeah, no, that was all great. So now I'm going to come to my attempt to analogically extend the categorical scheme from the primer on pure TB. So I guess before I go on, like, this is an attempt, and Yasha, you pointed out, like, the theory of the state in Lefebvre is very much the state in capitalism. So what I'm trying to recover, and part of the reason I've used the Mongol Empire, is an idea of a world empire and a TB that is dominant, right? And that has its own autonomous logic. So that's what we're trying to go for. So a provisional analogical extension of the primer methodology to TB. And I have been using the type signifiers instead of, or symbol instead of super or subscripts, just because I personally kind of lost track of when I was talking about functions or lattices or whatnot, so I just went like that. Also is easier than finding the super or subscript buttons all the time. So the general function I've called an adherence function. The reason I went with adherence is it captures two things I want to try to elaborate in this. The word adherence has a definition simply to like connect, to adhere, to put together two things, but you also adhere to a person or a cause or a group. It's very close to loyalty, which is something I'm going to be going into. Then to parallel like the bargaining space, and I think the definition is pretty much the same with the shifting exchanges for adherences. You have, and I don't really have a good single word, so I've called what are allocation spaces, but also rivalry spaces, the places within which you determine kind of like the different ways things can fit together, but also the different ways groups of people can fit together. So in this particular perspective, you don't really have a differentiation between the like things that are being moved around and the people that are being moved around, or the potential connections. What you're looking at predominantly is like, or the potential connections of like a subset of objects versus people. It's all abstract at this point. And what you are trying to distribute over that are shares of food, shares of power, shares of an army, whatever it might be, whether it's people, whether it's food, whatever. The parallel to the existence of a commodity is 80xx, which I think is actually a good idea to think about the concept of control, because basically, just like you can't have a commodity be worth less or be less exchangeable with itself than it can be with anything else. If you have a node of a logistical network that you don't have under control, anything else connected to it, you can't have more control over from the perspective of that point, right? Like a single node not working shuts down, which goes exactly to Toscano's point about blockades being kind of closer to logistics in the state as opposed to strikes and whatnot. As opposed to commodity measurable spaces, we then have resource measurable spaces and distribution networks. And then I get to where I actually bring up the Fundirum relationship. And I wanted to pick a word that, like the term value, could on the one hand be quantified, and physics basically has successfully quantified force in all kinds of ways, but also has like really big political and philosophical reverberations, like the concept of value, and gives us a space within which to look at force, whether that force be the way that military force is used, again, kind of looking at Badiou's analysis of the Battle of Gaugamela. And that's where this would appear, is on this level, because it's a topos, it's a transcendental functor. Or if you're looking at force in terms of like building a dam, moving the force of water, or directing forces in terms of transportation, right? Like you're looking at what Lefebvre constantly talks about in terms of flows and stocks, which even has a weird kind of parallel to actual and potential force or energy. And so things are looked at as force, but they're also looked at that in terms of like force and kind of like what we mean in terms of like relations of force, right? The actual capacity of people to accomplish things in a social space, and especially in terms of rivalries. And this comes into like an equivalent place, like the logic is very different, obviously, but it's an equivalent place of where equivalent and relative value come up. Like this idea of determining independence and the dialectic between them will kind of set in motion the rest of the stuff, in the same way that equivalent and relative value, once it kind of finds its atomic logic in the money form, is capable of like elaborating outwards, right? And so an atomic logic, we have to come up with some kind of idea, just like with the pack of cigarettes, of like a minimal resource. But I think as opposed to like when we look at the operations, localization, just like localization of the atomic logic in exchange, enables us to quantify. The localization in this enables to develop both a ranking in terms of like a ranking of people and a system of priorities, because that's something that comes up everywhere from kind of like the principles of logistics to the actual mathematics of logistics, like optimization, linear programming and stuff. It's all about setting priorities. And then from those priorities, kind of like examining the best possible combination of things. And then compatibility, I think, is a space to really like have a notion of how the state actually carries out homogenization through the process of regulation. And this is where we get a hierarchy form, which would be analogous to where like the money form comes up. And so we have to have, in order to do this, a formal use value. And I haven't come up with what that would look like, but I'm thinking something in terms of like binary trees, like a system of a taxonomic doing kind of thing. And then there's two aspects that we have to define here, which is the money form, which I think is part 7 of the primer, which is still like a form, it's a logic. And then currency, when you actually have money appear, is when it's mapped onto the other exchange transcendentals. So in the same way, we need to have a concept of like a hierarchy form. And again, this could be hierarchy in the sense of like a logical hierarchy as much as like a political hierarchy. And then how it actually instantiates once it is mapped onto the other exchange transcendentals. It's also at this level that I think we need to have concepts of like tribute, which I think tribute is kind of like the fundamental actual like economic relationship on TB, right? As opposed like I think it's bigger, like exchange and like the exchange space of a concept and an actual material exchange have the same word. Sorry, I'm getting off rant. My point is that we need to have a concept of tribute and then specifically taxation once you have an interaction with, you know, the money part, right? So again, these concepts, tribute you could conceive of on just TB, I think, but taxation is something that occurs on with the other exchange transcendentals. We now can get to a concept of the sovereign, which is similar to the place of capital, which is capable of seeing all of this. And finally, from there, we can develop a logistical point of view. And this is where I think things will really start to get different, right? Like to a certain extent, following Badiou, we're authorized to like the parts up to like, especially atomic logic should look similar because we're using very similar logical forms. But then how those logics kind of like complexify out once they get turned into operads and all these things. For example, like I stopped right before labor because I don't really have an idea of how to look at people in terms of resources in the same way that labor is looked at. So there's like a lot of stuff after this logic that I think I have to do a lot more hands-on research and stuff. But I think that this is a first attempt to put things in terms of the concepts. The dashed line in the middle is the place in the primer. It's the numbers don't quite map on, but like basically this is parallel to the 5th part, forms of value. And the 5th part ends on that comment about the incredibly complex and interesting space that can be explored by ultrafilters. So here to me is the natural place to draw a line of like above here, there's a lot to explore. And I think a lot to learn about in terms of like how we could integrate this in some larger communist project. But below that is where we start to instantiate in a way that develops this thing we're trying to overcome, the sovereign, in the same way we're trying to overcome capital. But it gives us an ability to like look at TB as a larger space within which we can, you know, do experiments and embed and kind of how do we come up with a collective or democratic logistics, et cetera, et cetera. So, okay, yeah. So I go into some more stuff, but this is, I think, the first actual thing in the presentation that I've tried to do. So I am really curious from everyone else how this looks and like critiques and stuff, so that like this can get refined.
Yeah, I'll say the one thing that at least to me seems difficult about sort of like universalizing TB or TA in specific compared to TC is because it's not like there is one TB in the same way that there is sort of one TC. right? There is sort of one global economy that is sort of completely intertwined. And maybe some parts of it are more cut off than others, but overall it's relatively connected. But there are also many states, right? There are not as connected and things with others. So
but I think that what
I think
John
that
is doing-
question is is an important place to
I totally agree, but at the same time,
yeah.
I think John is also equipped to deal with that because he's focusing on
Yeah.
logistics. Because
Mhm.
one of the limits to the reason why there are many states and that empires have limits is precisely because of logistics, right? But Alain, I had a comment. He wanted to say something. Just interrupt us, Alain. It's better.
Yeah, no, I was waiting for you to finish the exchange. Yeah, this seems very interesting. I have a few questions actually. So first, on this topic specifically, it seems that I understand the effort of trying to formalize TB, but it also seems to me that this is actually an attempt of structuring the homology of the TC to the TB within the mode within the structure in which C is dominant. So this is, it seems that it's more a way to understand the capitalist state than the state in general, or the statiality, so to speak, which would be this general element, this general principle that characterizes the mode of exchange B. So this is my first point. But the second one is, you chose to refer to force as analogous to value, and I wonder if power would not be a better term, in the sense that it seems that force lacks the relational aspect that value has in the structure of value theory, and it seems that force would perhaps be something more similar to use value, in the sense that it supposedly exists like independently from everything else, while power couldn't. It's hard to, I think it's impossible to understand power without the power relations in which it is embedded. And the second one is, it's interesting to think of money in terms of rank. But, and I'm saying this because I tried to make a very similar mapping of Marx's theory of value in political terms. And one problem of the money form is, and one of the difficulties of trying to put in terms of rank, is that rank kind of hinders exchange. So rank kind of organizes exchange and distributes the possibilities of what can be exchanged or not exchanged, while money is something that is present in all exchanges. So the use of actual money is a condition for exchange itself to take place. So it seems that I understand that rank is, so money is necessarily exceptional in the sense that it must be at first a commodity that is taken outside of the network of commodities that enables the network of commodities to exist in the first place. So in this sense, it makes sense to think in terms of rank. But at the same time, there is something about money that is present in all exchanges. So money is always there. So I wonder if something along the lines of the notion of right, for example, which is very different from rank, would make more sense. Because in every form of exchange, there is right is present somehow, and is operating in a certain way, and right and rank seem to be connected, but at the same time they might be different. And this kind of connects to my first point about this being a structure of the capitalist state, and less a structure of state in general, or the imperial logic, or of a mode of exchange, or a structure in which the mode of exchange B dominates over the others. And And perhaps this another possibility for money would be sovereignty itself, instead of sovereign being the analogous to capital. And then if sovereign is not the analogous to capital, then the question becomes like, what would be analogous to capital? And perhaps the state itself could be a solution. And I think that one aspect in this that is relevant too is that capital is something that can be accumulated. And I'm not sure if sovereign is something that can be accumulated, since that sovereign is a structure, and it's always like the top, it's always like absolute power relative to the existing powers. So I'm not sure if sovereignty itself can be accumulated, but in this one, I'm more uncertain. And I just wanted to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, well, I'll start with the force thing and work outwards from there. I agree that power is a good alternative there, but I wanted to, especially with the idea of the hierarchy form, kind of bring power out, because part of the reason I went with force is I think like there's a way in which, before you get to what we traditionally look at the state as like a political agent of wielding power, there's a perspective of the state as, or the logic out of which the state develops is a set of problems around how to get resources from one place to another in terms of these adherences, right? So if we go back to the original starting point of the distinction from Marx, the idea is plunder, right? Like the exchange is plunder, right? Like the exchange is not an exchange based on right or agreement or consensus. It's about the capacity to take something, and the plunder, I think, is secondary. It's like, it's not about using violence. It's the fact that you treat the resource in such a way that whatever kind of obstacle, whether or not that's a person or a river or whatever, that obstacle, it is just that, is an obstacle to be overcome, right? So, sorry, I've got kids yelling in the background. So yeah, so I think like the problem of force is that I don't want to be on people quite yet. Like I want the relationships between people to emerge later on in the logic. Likewise with right and even law, and I'll get to this in a second. I think part of my critique of the idea of the state and the law in a lot of theories is I think that they assume a level of homogeneity that doesn't actually exist. Like in this logical system, I think the state and the law emerge out of the interaction between exchange transcendentals. I don't think law or right belong to pure TB, and this is one of my ongoing critiques of how Karatani describes TB.
Can I just interrupt you on? It seems I understand what you're saying, and I agree. I think it's an interesting point, but also it seems that capital can start ideally with dealing with things and commodities, but like soon this disappears and you realize that it must be the case that labor power is a commodity for everything else to be in place, and you must have like a certain juridical distinction between persons and things in order for people to exchange commodities. And then this is the movement from chapter 1 to chapter 2 of Capital, right? But when it comes to the state, on the one hand, this distinction is there like from the start. Like this is the structure of Roman law, like this distinction between person and things. But from the standpoint of the state, I'm not sure if it makes sense to start with the distinction, because the state like treats as resources like people and things indistinctly from the very basic. So like the fact that you have people and the fact that you have like tools and have the fact that you have guns and the fact that you have territory, everything is just like the minimal elements of the composition of the state. So I'm not sure. I understand that you want to preserve the distinction categorically to formulate the argument.
No, to clarify, I don't want to. I'm sorry if I miscommunicated. I definitely don't want that distinction.
So people would be like primary resources.
Insofar as the state looks at it. Excuse me, I gotta step away again. I'm not, my stomach.
Fuck, I'm so sad that John is not feeling good. But Alan, I really agree with you.
Okay.
Yeah. see if he comes back. But I really agree with you, Alan, on this. I think that it's, I feel like the way that John is constructing this, there is a bit of an inversion where he's assuming that the most concrete comes first. So like very encrusted presentations of logistical spaces and resources, which are actually a conquest of late modernity, you know? They are ridiculously concrete, like abstractions go really deep. Man, are you?
Yeah, I'm fine.
I'm just so worried about you.
Feel free to
Don't be.
continue this later.
Too little food, too much coffee, that kind of thing. Weak stomach.
Okay.
Not really
the
sick.
coffee syndrome, I know well. Yes.
Yeah, I actually feel really bad because Alan, your points are very good, and I wish I'd caught all of them.
I was just telling Alan that I think that I agree with him on one point, which I think that if you invert it, a lot of things will get, I mean, I really like where you're heading with this. I just think that if you invert one hypothesis that you're using, it will make things fit much better and stop being an analogy with what we developed on TC, which I think can only take you so far. Like the analogies are good when you're bringing using them to use take the formal aspect as being the common one, but they're a bit shaky when you end up using the content that is being formalized as
the semantics.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't think you need to be so strict on finding the commonality between money form and things like this, because I think we can already. I would, in one moment I would try to suggest something a bit more formal that will clarify this, I think. But if the hypothesis that I think that if you drop or you invert, which is goes in the line of what Alan was saying, will clarify things, is something we were just saying when you were out, which is the most concrete presentation weirdly comes at the end. It doesn't come at the beginning. So it doesn't really tell you about how things started, right? So, so for example, it's something that we already saw in our reconstruction of Marx, and the thing that I'm doing with Thiago on Viveros and Lévi-Strauss is showing the same thing, which is you get a sort of accidental transcendental form, which is inconsistent. It is highly abstract first. And then it's a big trouble to find what material kind of flow or process gets to kind of embed that logic into the world more concretely. So for example, that's why in structural anthropology, kinship is an abstract logic of affinity first, and bloodlines are just, let's say, stabilizing that affinity logic. So affinity is the abstract, it comes first. And the concrete is just, let's say, the material means for kind of embedding that abstraction onto the world. So I even think that you get a more contemporary look at force, because force looks like power without an agent, right? It looks like a capacity to shape things without a conscious desire to shape being present in any way. It looks like it's a development of a more abstract relational thing, rather than, even though it looks more concrete, precisely because it's concrete, it comes later. You see my point? Like, so if you invert it, I think that clarifies. And one thing that it clarifies like crazy.
Clear, what exactly, which terms are you inverting?
So, so the first thing would be here. So in this general logic that you're talking about, I would imagine that you're coming up with an idea, with a concept of power first. And once we find a sort of material atom, like the sort of underlying lineament, as we use the word, like the sort of salts in our property of the material space to kind of harbor power, it starts appearing sometimes without agency. And then it looks like just sheer force, right? It looks like it's competing with rivers and not with commandments, right? But I think that even though it looks more primitive, that's precisely why it comes later. That's the weird thing that I think that it would help. So
yeah, and I think that this maps out with Marx's own method. And I think that this is what it's hard, right? If it's a similar inversion, than what Marx himself did, which seems to, so like, for example, of course, we have commercial capital and finance capital before industrial capital. But what Marx must do in terms of the structure of his own argument is precisely to show how industrial capital kind of precedes logically finance capital and commercial capital. So this is why he has to deal with them later, even though they preceded historically. And in political terms, it seems to be a similar relationship between government and sovereignty, for example. So you think of problems of government, they exist like since from the start of political philosophy, and you could like reconstruct several theories of government and administration of persons and things. It's with so, but at some point there is a shift. Like you can track to be like probably together with the advent of capital itself as like a social formation that kind of gives structure to reality. And that's the moment, that's the historical moment in which the notion of sovereignty starts to arise. So, but the point is that you must have something that is kind of primordial in abstract terms that is able to construct and to complexify into sovereignty. But then from sovereignty, you have to arrive to a certain concrete logic of administration similar to government, which seems to be your point about logistics.
Absolutely.
But then, so then you cannot start with something so concrete like force. You have to find the equivalent to the minimal abstract entity that enables you to construct something to reach sovereignty, which I think is power, which has that degree of concreteness, but abstraction too, and that is relational and substantial at the same time, and enables you to build into a notion of sovereignty.
The thing that I wanted to add, I totally agree with Alan. I think that it's a very small shift in the way you were thinking, because I have the impression that that's pretty much already how we were approaching things. The thing that I think can be added more clearly when you do this, in my opinion, like just to give an idea of how I see this, for example, this first space here, this first step here, just to show how this is actually a very powerful idea, right? So for example, and how the way you conceive this actually changes this quite considerably later on.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
you might have to, I mean, this, I agree where you put this line, because it might require quite a bit of reinventing. I mean, it's a very interesting exercise formally as well, because currently, like our exchange function, it's like this. You have two things, and we're going to evaluate their equivalence, and we accept more or less equivalences, right? So it's between totally non-equivalent amongst any value up to totally equivalent, right? So that means that if we have like three things like this, from the perspective of this commodity, this, let's say, is totally exchangeable, and this is kind of more or less exchangeable, right? And this actually will tell you something about this value as well. It cannot be any value. Okay. This condition of the problem, how then you make exchange? This is like basic accidental exchange in a way that is even more general than Marx, because we accept non-equivalent values of exchangeability. And then there's a big problem to move from this exchange from the perspective of one person, right? A guy walking with a commodity and looking at two other commodities, to a consistent space where I can take anyone's position and all the inverse relations still hold, right? We know that this is the big problem that we try to show in the primer, how to move towards consistent exchange spaces and then to money and so on. But you have a similar interesting problem with this, which is given, so to use your function here, given two elements, right, two objects, they can either adhere or not adhere, right? I like that idea of the binary aspect of it for many reasons. We spoke about how commitments, contracts, it seems to be all about either you have it or you don't. It's not really a matter of more or less having a contract. You're already kind of out of picture. And actually quite nicely, you can start looking, imagining you have like a network like this, okay? And you have relations, for example, like this. If you start, for example, I think quite intuitively, if I tell you that these guys don't have a relation, these guys don't have a relation, and these guys don't have a relation, but they all have a relation to C, right? They're all committed to C, but not committed to each other. That already tells you, if I ask you who's the king in this operation, you already know who it is, right? It captures quite intuitively the idea that you can see everything from C, right? But you're allowed not to have relations because you have relations here, right? In a sort of triangulation, right?
But I think that's where, oh, sorry.
So I think that this is a very basic idea, and it treats in the same way property and commitment, right? I think that's even a good way to define what power is. Power is when commitments and properties are the same, right? If I have a relation to an object, or I have a commitment to a person, right? The perspective at which commitment and property are the same, it's when people and things can kind of be treated as resources, as we were talking about, right? But if you now try to move to the problems of how do I make this consistent from everyone's perspective, right? Right? This person sees a commitment to C and B, but perhaps B doesn't see a commitment back. So when you start now trying to construct the space which makes this thing consistent, it will look very differently from our money space.
Oh yeah.
Or exchange space. So I think that this might look very different when you start with this other function here. It won't look like an analogous thing. It will have properties that our spaces don't, and vice versa, right?
So you're saying basically like the point that I made, that after 10 it gets crazy different. You're saying after 6 it's going to get crazy different.
Yeah, yeah, it will get different in that way, and I think that that's a really good thing, because that means you're using the same tools but not making an analogy with capital. That means actually following the thread more immanently, right? What does it mean to arrive at the concept of power, of rank, hierarchy, of something that measures a space of commitments, or whatever we want to call them, immanently, right? We need to, if this idea makes sense, we need to be able to derive all of that from this basic thing. And I think that one important thing I would add to your point 7 here, like in the primer, I think we made a good point in showing how labor power and this sort of compositional logic of production functions in a way that is, it has the same function within capitalism as bloodlines have with regards to kinship. That's why the atom of kinship for Lévi-Strauss is a weird mixture between a sort of symbolic structure and a material structure, right? It's blood plus affinity. It's a mixture of the two, right? In the same way that production is not the other side of exchange. Production in capitalism is a mixture of producing towards value. So value is in reality shaping what labor is, right? But at the same time, you do get to kind of surf the strains of production, right? And I think that we have a name for this atom already in state theory. It's called the two bodies of the king. The two bodies of the king is, classically, I would say is the closest thing to the atom of kinship. The idea that when you focused on a more classical figure of sovereignty, and there are good theorists who show how to generalize the problem of the two bodies of the king to sort of disseminated duality or whatever. But the two bodies of the king, it kind of puts into place this problem of, it even looks like Fundirum, like there's a factitious.
The
factical, I don't know, the fact body and the function body. So it totally fits that, right? And it's precisely a sort of the thing that allows you to move from this accidental power structure that I just drew here, right? Where you have, let's say, something like this. And for example, these two have a relation to this guy and they don't have amongst each other. Like, how can you generalize this and guarantee consistency, right? Well, you would have to partition people in such a way that the atomic composition is partly built upon something physical and material, but that physical material thing is just the material support for a function.
It's actually an interesting way to say, like, to induce almost a biopolitics out of this. And biopolitics is concerned with the relationship between the factical bodies and the functioning bodies.
Yeah, I think all our projects. Yeah, wow. I think we totally. I mean, we totally subsume the problem of biopolitics in this kind of approach we're doing, because the postulate of materialism, this idea that atomic predicates, the basic predicative building blocks of a logic, they need to have a material counterpart, which is something Badiou enforces, and that you need to be able to project this sort of symbolic logical structure back onto the ontological. Well, when you're dealing with people, that's exactly what's going to do. You're going to have a political shaping of something quite concrete and material about people's constitutions, right? So I would add somewhere here, like into the discussion, like, since this is the part where you're starting to wonder, how does this logic from 1 to 6 become concretely embedded, right? As Alan was saying, like, how do we invert it to put the concrete in the last instance here, like it arrives later, right? I think that the emergence in actually late medieval, like early modern kind of discussion, I mean, it's actually much older than that, right? But I think that's a really good kind of thread to follow, you know? And there's even a nice, I mean, it's totally out of it's within the topic, but a bit out of the presentation. There's a really nice continuum you can explore to show how this gets made more concrete. But because if you look at, let's say, pre-Christian, the fable of Menentius de Agrippa, you know, the guy who came up with that idea of, he was a patrician, right, who was tasked with kind of stopping an upheaval of the plebeians somewhere in God knows where. And then he went there and he told that famous story about, you know, we're all part of a body. You guys are the hands, somebody else is the mouth, somebody else is the feet. And I know you guys are tired of, you know, having your resources plundered, but you need to understand there's a whole. And if the mouth stops taking the food to the hands stop taking the food to the mouth that goes to the stomach, the hands also die, right? So it's that kind of put the state as a sort of body kind of inaugurates that idea. But everyone is kind of an organ. There is nothing kind of grounding that idea. It's just an abstract kind of thing. And it goes all the way to Christianity deciding who gets to be the head, right? And then the king is no longer just the head, but he is actually divided between being a part of the body and being the head of the body. So it's a long history of kind of this becoming more and more concrete.
You can even trace this back to Plato's Callipolis, which is structured in precisely those three terms. What I wanted to say was actually, it seems that what enables you to have in that structure of A, B, and C that you draw earlier, I think that what it enables you to have that stabilized is precisely the notion of sovereignty. And the reason why this is the case is that sovereignty is a point of a certain, I want to say a point of indistinction, but it is certainly defined both by power and right. So, and it seems that power and right are the political terms to address the factitious and the functional, the material and the symbolic in this case. And to speak in political terms, you have to find a way to addressing both at the same time. And I think that sovereignty is what enables you to have a structure of right and a structure of power that not necessarily are correspondent perfectly, but that one operates in the kind of double character that Marx is establishes for value and for the kind of this duality that operates simultaneously. One that is kind of a certain semiotics of rights and the concrete material political relations of power. And just one final thing, I think that I'm not sure if the two bodies of the king work in this. I think it does, but I'm a little, I think the sovereignty might be a better term, more general, because the two bodies of the king, even in Kantorovic's work, they are a solution for the problem of sovereignty and the problem of how to have someone that is a ruler and that is not necessary. It's not a god, but is a person. So like this is what is at stake in there, and it's a kind of a very precarious solution to have and it is a solution to a problem of of identifying the ruler with the sovereign. And I think that this was precisely Hobbes's point with the social contract theory and the notion of sovereignty, which was different from what came before. But I'm just a little suspicious of the pure generalization of the two bodies of the king, because it is a specific, it's a very specific form of something that is necessarily more general.
No,
and
I totally agree. I
Kantorovic's-
didn't mean in that sense. It's just to clarify something, Alan, because I think also this is kind of in between the lines in this. Like, the distinction between what he's calling please correct me, John, if I'm wrong, but distinction between what he's calling atomic logic and this sovereign here. Even if we add the sovereign here before, as you said, which I agree, and we substitute this for the state proper, right? Even in that case, the point is kind of like this. The way that this formalism is structured, you start by developing something like an abstract, we can call it like symbolic to facilitate, a sort of symbolic logic. And the problem is that symbolic logic, it's too general, but inconsistent. So what you want to do is to find a way to redescribe the terms that are at stake in that logic with more primitive predicates, more kind of finding the building blocks, such that when you recompose the objects from that perspective, those objects will now be consistent with one another. So for example, you have inconsistent exchange between commodities, but once you add the money commodity, you can actually recompose all other commodities from the perspective of their price. So now the whole space makes sense because you can price all the commodities. But a condition for this sort of consistent discussion is an intermediary step where we found a way to, which is this atomic logic, describing the parts of these objects in a way that will allow for this later consistency. That doesn't need to be the consistency of the part itself. Doesn't mean that everything is a money commodity, right? With formal use value like gold or whatever. Like it's just a step so that you can construct the objects later on, guaranteeing some of that consistency. And the guy that I was thinking of is not even Kantorovich, is this guy called Eric Santner. I'm sure Alain read him. Eric Santner has a theory that modernity is not really the time of sovereignty centered around a person, but because that is an inconsistent position. And he kind of, his example of that is the French Revolution and the fact that the people who were all for the empty seat of power could not be themselves depicted as heroes, because that would place them back in the position of representing everyone, and that was a contradiction. So that contradiction was quite clear aesthetically in the paintings of the time and so on. And his solution is, well, this is why we get with Freud a theory of the masses, because this excess, which was supposed to be concentrated in the figure of one person, gets kind of disseminated through everyone. Everyone is kind of a bit more than themselves, right? But still, I'm not sure if that's an accepted theory. It's just what was in my mind. But just to show something here with this little drawing I made. For example, you have here 5 terms, right? You can see that A, C, and D, right? These arrows here, they have commitments amongst. Actually, I wanted to draw this a bit differently, but yeah, imagine that this. Let me just redo one arrow here. So yeah, this arrow is wrong. This arrow. Let's redo it. So everyone has a commitment to D, right? And not necessarily to themselves. So you see that this thing here, oh fuck. Okay, yeah, this thing here is kind of centered around this, right? And not even D has a commitment to E. So this part here is outside. So this is the limit, let's say the limit of a space of, for example, rights. Everyone has a relation to this, but insofar as D doesn't have a relation to E, no commitment there, you could say that this is beyond the scope of some common space, right? And furthermore, you're not obliged to treat sovereignty as a personal thing. For example, imagine that you can have something here that is better equipped to have commitments with everyone than D itself. For example, there's someone very far away who has a commitment with this. This could be a currency minted by the state. It represents something of sovereignty in currency form. It doesn't need to behave like money, but we know that currency existed much prior to money, right? They allow, for example, for people to be paid by the state. So you could have, if the king has a one relation to this, so there is a commitment here, and everyone has a commitment to X, you could have other structures that, let's say, are a sort of surrogate sovereign, if you want. So this can get very complex, right? And this already gives you a sort of logistical idea, because this X can go in places that, because D is a person, D has some limited space of action, right? So if you have how do you call it, like subjects, like very far away, or even inside this outside space here, they might have a connection with X, but not with D directly. You see my point? So like this actually can go very far, though it looks like a children's drawing, right?
Yeah, no, I see. I think I understand better. But it seems that rights need to enter the picture somehow. It seems that rights are exactly the name of what Sandner was describing in his account. Mm-hmm. And it's not by chance that it's at the moment of the French Revolution, in which you have the universalism of rights, and then everyone becomes like has some kind of natural right to political decision. That's precisely the moment, and rights is what enables you. So, but also like we have to have a theory of what rights are, in the kind of subjective sense, because rights are something that are abstract enough to independ from actual commitments that you have, because they are this kind of just potential relations that you have, just like, for example, property rights. It's not my relation to the thing, it's my relation against everyone else. This is what is at stake in the right to something. So you don't have to actually have a relation, like a concrete commitment to anyone, because right is precisely the name of this abstract commitment that everyone must have, and have this juridical logic of like presupposed of like voluntary obligation or tacit consent, or and everything else that is embedded in juridical talk and juridical logic. So rights must enter the picture as somewhere, and right seems to be the basic of rank too, because rank enables you to have claims over things, and enables you to claim to a third party. When you have some problem, you can litigate, etc., etc. So the problem,
but from what you're saying, rights presuppose a totality in a way that rank doesn't yet, right? Rank can be more
I think that's
local than rights, right?
That's kind of what I'm thinking, is like that the rank, like rank in a sense, sets the problem to which rights itself is a solution in a way, in the way I'm thinking of it. Like rights comes out of this framework as an attempt to address it on a more general level. I want to go to the next slide because I think it
Sure,
kind of
yeah.
because part of this is, and this goes to another aspect of our conversation, Gabriel, is like the problem of kind of like dealing with the state, considering how old it is and how many different, like, it's existed in so many different ways, and ideologically it's existed from myth to science. So I think part of the issue is kind of separating out TB from the ways it localizes on the others. So this is a graph to try to show what we're trying to separate out from the totality. As you mentioned earlier, actually, like there's this weird way that commodities and resources kind of map onto each other. And in the same way, and you see this with the Mongol Empire, the Mongol Empire as a world empire co-emerged, but was not identical to the Mongol nation. You could only be a member of the Mongol nation if you were a Mongolian, but you could be a subject of the world empire, the Mongol Empire. And this was a strictly enforced distinction because you could marry into, along the traditional kind of like TA kinship lines, the Mongolians, but you could not learn the language and like choose to enter as a part of like the empire. So it remained in a weird kind of way more tightly articulated on TA. And this is something that happens, right? Like Karatani very explicitly links the nation as the place that kind of TA community belonging reemerges once the state becomes dominant. Though in the next slide, I'll have some critiques of the way he goes about that. But there's this tendency of the state to relocalize on a national space, and that's both like a national territory, but also like a social space. And then there's a way that resources have always, and this goes way before even states, like commerce and commodity exists in non-state societies. So resources have always potentially commodities, and commodities can always be looked at as resources. But from that definition, you then develop, in my opinion, and this is, I think probably the basis of a debate or disagreement, the concept of citizen and property, which are the assumptions, and I don't go so much, I'm not as familiar in general with the literature of the state, but I'm mostly going out of Hegel's philosophy of right. And the will, which one of my readings is that the will, as he describes it, is the will of a citizen. Like it's not a fully abstract will. But the starting point of the philosophy of right is the interaction between will and property. And in a way, it's civil law precedes criminal law in this case. And there are like actual institutions that end up regulating these connections, right? So in the term of, when you mapped out the logic of kinship, Gabriel, you had this 0-1-2 logic, and the intermediate term represented this kind of like this intermediate space of belonging that doesn't exist for the state, which is either 1 or 0. And the way that is actually dealt with by the state, I'm arguing, is through something like the naturalization of immigrants. Like the actual instability is then mapped onto a 0-1. In the same way, commodities end up being registered, regulated, and secured by the state insofar as those commodities appear back again as resources. So there's this like, these different moments have to be dealt with practically. Like they're not just abstractions, they're actual things that exist that cause problems. There's also aspects of this that are incomplete. Like for example, Karatani's analysis focuses on just the nation, but if you look at Hegel's text, society actually begins with the family, and that's where kinship is. So there's like no real place for the nuclear family and the modern family in Karatani's text right now that needs to be developed. But for me,
Can I ask, would you say that citizenship is kind of like the prototypical one of these, what do you call them, from the previous, these functions from 0 to 1?
No, I think citizen and property both come at, like they're not pure in the sense of being TA or TB or TC. They come from on the level of the complex social formation interaction. So these are like,
you wouldn't say citizenship doesn't come from TB?
No, that's what I'm saying. Like the combination of these two, state and nation and resource and commodity, sorry, yeah, it's unclear from, oh, dang. It's unclear from this, I realize now, but yeah, it's the way those two map onto each other that the law deals with that problem. Like the law is a way of dealing with the heterogeneity of transcendentals, but very much from the perspective of the state. It is very much dominated by the state, but it's not itself imminent to the logic of TV.
Yeah, I mean, we can just say that, I mean,
Okay.
citizens are a modern inversion. You can have subjects that are not citizens. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you can have members of a nation that aren't citizens, right? You have to have a nation state to have a citizen, and you have to have like a national economy to have property, and not just have like objects or things. So here are a couple of the problems for Karatani, and I know we're getting late on time, and there's a lot of like the empirical stuff now is what's for the rest of the presentation. But these are I think because of my focus, which has been in nationalism and geopolitics and like how this stuff like causes a problem. For me, part of the problem with Karatani and Gellner, and it's a little far afield of where the topic is now, but if you go back to the chapter in his book on nationalism, he relies heavily on this guy named Ernest Gellner, who's kind of one of the fathers, at least in the Anglophone world, of nationalism studies. And I think Karatani recapitulates Gellner well. I think he like summarizes him well. And basically the idea is that nationalism is a product of the kind of like mass urban alienation brought about by industrial society, which is a main concept for Gellner. Industrial society kind of produces through concentration, alienation, the conditions for needing a new belonging. And then the state uses that basically for its own projects, right? So industrial society creates a need for belonging, and the state leverages that for its own interests in nationalism, right? Both for the goods of capitalism and for its own kind of geopolitical terms. And while that analysis is definitely useful in trying to understand how nationalism developed to where it was, particularly leading up to World War I, when we kind of think of as like when nationalism literally blew up the world in Austria-Hungary down the Balkans, but like the prototype of that in Gellner's analysis is French nationalism. And I think there's a couple problems in locating French nationalism, specifically in the processes of industrialization and the revolution itself. Like, obviously, it reached the pinnacle and transformed in a certain way into revolutionary universal nationalism. But when we're trying to understand nationalism in the way that Karatani describes it, as a new form of belonging, I'm really convinced by Barbara Tuchman's book, A Distant Mirror, which examines the period between the mid-13 and mid-1400s and the triple catastrophe of the 100 Years' War between France and England, the Black Death, and then the conquest of Constantinople by the Turks, or the Ottomans. And out of that, especially out of the 100 Years' War and the occupation of southern France by England, peasant nationalism began to emerge. And it became a way of self-definition that transcended the various parochial localisms. And basically, in part, it became a means for the peasants to demand that the aristocrats actually do something. They say, we're all French. You are our lords who are sovereign, who owe fealty to the king. And insofar as you are French, you have to protect the French lands from the English invader. And this was a transformation for Tuchman, because the English had held lands in France, just as the French had held lands in England. And the peasants hadn't cared throughout the medieval period necessarily which country occupied land. It was much more a relationship to the particular lord. But first off, there'd already been a process of kind of like transnational expansion through the high medieval economy, and the kind of, which actually was fueled by the Mongol Empire. So that's a big component there. But really came in resistance to this English occupation. So that the nationalism as a form of belonging identification precedes by centuries its revolutionary transformation under industrial conditions. So there needs to be a distinction there, even if obviously it's, what played a role in the French Revolution is very important. there's also this, I would say, shadow side, or what you want to call it, the repressive obverse, which is Breton nationalism. The French nationalism, like many nationalisms throughout the world, has defined itself in smashing Breton nationalism, which is in the northwest of France. And I haven't had, like, my former partner and longtime collaborator lives there now, and she's been sharing a lot about this dynamic. So I've been learning through that. But very much the entire history of the French nation has depended upon, has been in an antagonistic relationship, and to certain degrees conciliatory, with Breton nationalism. And it shows in many ways, and there's countless other examples. This is just useful because the French play such a key role in nationalism studies as a prototype, that like this existence of a nationalism, of Breton nationalism, was not tied or founded upon a state, right? In fact, it existed in opposition to a state that was trying to trounce it. And so this structure of belonging, however much it's tied to the nation state, I think when you look at Karatani and Giltner's analysis, they end up relying on industrial society, so capitalism, TC, and the state, TB. And they don't actually, despite his argument, which is correct, that nationalism is a form of community belonging, I don't think Karatani pushes the argument far enough. There's also various other lines of research that need to look out. Like I think Silvia Federici and the entire line of social reproduction, the way that, and nationalism and gender and family all play a lot into this too. But the way that nationalism created an ideological community that was not simply reducible to the state. My particular point of research, which had to do with the Russo-Chechen War in the Caucasus, looked at the way that the state space of the former Soviet Union was fragmented by nationalist movements. And I think this is a way we kind of extend some of that lines of logic from Lefebvre, that fragmentation also occurs in different ways. Like there's not just exchange fragmentation. If you look at the Russo-Chechen War, what happened in the former Yugoslavia, the Tajikistan Civil War, like all these things that happened in the 90s with the collapse of the state system, and the way that nationalist movements, like there's a way I think that you can look at nationalist movements as proto-states, and that is true in a lot of ways, but it's, I think, incorrect formally to identify the two. They often become practically indifferentiable, especially if it's a national liberation movement that's become militarized or has a party form. But I think when you look at, and this comes down to a last point. I don't know how it was in Brazil, but here in the United States, when the Rojava experiment took off and the Yapuga and the Yapuja were fighting ISIS, a lot of like anarchists and left communists looked at Rojava as the quote next model, right? And there's a lot of problems with that, but I think the overwhelming one is the complete omission of what a central role Kurdish nationalism plays in the unifying idiomatic like structure of all these experiments on the ground, whether they're in Syria or Turkey or Iraq or elsewhere, right? Like Kurdish nationalism, which has a very like, all kinds of different ideologies are embodied and exist in Kurdish nationalism, is absolutely inseparable from how the Rojava experiment has been carried out, from its efficacy and whatnot, and trying to study an organizational form without taking account the effects of these particular nationalist forms of belonging, I think really skews the analysis, right? So there are ways that we need to separate nationalism when we're analyzing the state, and there are ways that we need to consider nationalism when we're looking at certain organizations, because it has its own kind of logic, which I think Karatani starts us down the road. There's a lot of work to go down, and these are some of the issues there. But I totally agree with him, and I think he like makes a very important step in that direction, and it totally confirms what most nationalism studies people have said, which is like there is this thing about nationalism that has its own kind of way of acting that states have a really hard time understanding when they're not under the form of a state already, when they exist as autonomous nationalist movements. So I think there's things to kind of study and look at there. And then we're going into the Mongols, which I mean, we're close to out of time. So I don't know how, we're at 5:40, well, 5:45 my time. We're at like almost 3 hours. So I just kind of want to see where people are at, because there's a lot of stuff.
We just need to get to the map, man. I just need some map.
You want some map? Yeah.
Could you also send these slides just in the WhatsApp immediately as well?
Yeah,
so we can Just
Totally, absolutely.
Look at the Mongol stuff
Yeah,
later.
I know this
No,
is
for
how
fun.
this is how I got through all the boring logic stuff.
Yeah.
Was the tease the
The
Mongol
thing,
tease.
yeah.
So yeah, so honestly, like, so this is another outcome of the conversation with you, Gabriel, like the difficulty, like, and I decided this was a kind of wager I made, and I think it bore out, but I mean, I have to read more books and have other people weigh in on it. But in the way that Marx chose Britain as a paradigmatic place to kind of like study capitalism instead of studying all capitalisms, not that there were a ton at the time, but you know, there were many countries. I decided to take the Mongolian Empire as a paradigmatic world empire, especially I think given the dominance of Rome in Europe as like the paradigmatic world empire. I think Mongolian Empire is a better for what we're trying to look at. Why? So first off, exceptional scale. It's huge and it happened very quickly. And so that produced a minimal state, which had to be therefore a maximally logistical state. In other words, it couldn't afford what we'd call like bureaucratic excess in the beginning. We had to see like what was necessary was what actually kind of like held in place. Now, obviously over the centuries, what devolved into various empires became far more, quote, decadent. But in that short time of the first century, you see like a remarkable amount of organization, but a very little amount of organization considering how big the empire was. The rapid genesis, it moved from a very like kinship-based society with very little structure to a world empire in literally like one man's lifetime. So we get to see how TA turns into TB and the tensions between the two. The structural elegance, again, this kind of goes with exceptional scale. Like it's just a very well-designed system. Like there's a design elegance to it that I do find interesting. Division, disintegration. The Mongol Empire collapsed almost as quickly as it like, at least as a whole, as it came together. And so the way it collapsed has studies and like the particular way that TB disintegrates. The problem with the great individual hypothesis. Genghis Khan is a remarkable and interesting individual, and it raises the typical question of like, what is the role between this large social process and individuals? And also, I think, and you brought up the double body theory, Gabriel. I think it's super interesting because Genghis Khan refused in a certain kind of way to allow the memorialization of like the sovereign body. When he died, his soldiers buried him like out in the middle of nowhere. No one to this day knows where he was buried. And the entire land that he was buried in became like a no-go zone. No one was allowed in there but the royal family. And this existed through the history of the Soviet Union. Like the entire area of the Soviet Union became like it's this like amazing image. I haven't found a picture yet, but like the entire perimeter was surrounded in like military equipment and industrial leakage and all this toxicity. And then inside of it was this pristine, untouched wilderness. And it occupied for centuries this place in the Mongolian imaginary as a substitute for what would have been Genghis Khan's body. And it kind of like, it's almost like he was trying to resist precisely this like double body thing. And it also bears upon one of his innovations, which was the universalization of law. It didn't hold for very long, but Genghis Khan.
I would interpret that as showing that it's land, not the human body, that serves as the backbone.
Exactly. Yeah. It was a very interesting. And then finally, new material for the backwater hypothesis. This particular book, which is this guy right here, the book I've read, really makes strong arguments that most of what laid the stage for European capitalism technologically and commercially was inherited directly from the Mongol Empire. And so really trying to understand the relation, like the Europeanness of things is very up for question after this history. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. This book is very much written like a New York Times bestseller, and there's a lot of annoying kind of grandiose language in it. But this fellow is a cultural anthropologist who helped translate a critical text about the history of the Mongolian Empire, traveled around for years in the area, like tracing out the movements of the groups, reconstructing history. So he's very it's a very well-researched book, even if it's not necessarily from a left perspective always hits nail on the head. Whether in their policy of religious tolerance, devising a universal alphabet, maintaining relay stations, playing games, or printing almanacs, money, or astronomy charts, the rulers of the Mongol Empire displayed a persistent universalism. Because they had no system of their own to impose upon their subjects, they were willing to adopt and combine systems from everywhere. Without deep cultural preferences in these areas, the Mongols implemented pragmatic rather than ideological solutions. They searched for what worked best. When they found it, they spread it to other countries. They did not have to worry about their astronomy, agree with the precepts of the Bible, that their standards of writing followed the classic precepts taught by the Mandarins in China, or that Muslim imams disapproved of their printing and painting. The Mongols had the power, at least temporarily, to impose new international systems of technology, agriculture, and knowledge that superseded the predilections and prejudices of any single civilization. And in so doing, they broke the monopoly of thought exercised by local elites. And they had, like, they killed most of the local elites.
That's how they broke the monopoly.
That's how they broke it.
They broke it by killing them.
They complete every place they went. All these places had these conventions of like how nobles wouldn't kill each other while the peasants did, and they would come in. The Mongols would come in and execute all the rulers, and surprisingly, people weren't that pissed about it. So it became a very effective conquest strategy.
Elegant, as you said. Very
elegant, exactly. In conquering their empire, not only the Mongols revolutionized warfare, created a nucleus of universal culture and world system, and again, this guy claims that provided foundations for commerce, open communication, shared knowledge, secular politics, religious coexistence, international law, and diplomatic community. So there's a lot of strong claims here. That again, some of these things get attributed to earlier European or pre-European forms, and he's making a claim that these precedents were actually much more historically closer to Europe, but not from Europe. They're from this Asiatic despotism on a whole new level. So here's a map.
Yes.
This is the successful conquest. You know,
Oh, yeah.
we're starting here, like a little bit here, and within a lifetime of a single Temujin, Genghis Khan conquered, and his grandson, so a couple lifetimes, conquered this area, which then in the fragmentation turned into this. So this gives us like a nice picture of the conquest. The red is Genghis Khan, green are his grandsons mostly, and then yellow is the trip of Marco Polo, who helped facilitate trade relationships with the Mongol Empire that brought things like noodles for the first time to Europe, all kinds of clothing, printing presses, gunpowder and gunpowder weaponry, compasses. All these technologies came through commerce from the Mongol Empire. And one of the main reasons the Mongols didn't go further than they did here into Europe was they thought Europe was too poor and not worth the effort. So it was like not a rich place. They conquered Persia and China, which were by far the richest places at the time. And they could get good resources from Moscow and from up here, lots of wood and minerals and whatnot. But they weren't that interested in Europe. So Mongol innovations. There's not much time. I don't want to go too much in the biography, but basically, Genghis Khan instituted a bunch of innovations. He also lived in a society that I think demonstrates why I'm skeptical of a certain romanticization of TA that I think is present in Karatani, because the kinship network he grew up in was an incredibly brutal, like power struggle, like lots of complications. And technically it's a submargin, so there's a lot of complications. But the point is that like it was a traditional kinship network that had what was called a white bone and black bone distinction. And white bones were the elites and black bones were everyone else. And what Genghis Khan did was, within his tribe, give positions based on merit, even if people belong to this lower caste. And he effectively broke this two-tier caste system by giving positions of generalship and whatnot to like lower people within the society. He also integrated tribes largely by killing leaders and sometimes the adult males, but as opposed to previous tribes that would generally just loot and maybe take some slaves and then leave them alone, these other tribes were fully integrated, but they were integrated as members. And I think this is an interesting place to look at the concept of right, which I have neglected here, because that was fundamental from the beginning. He centralized looting and the redistribution of what was looted. So an entire city would be conquered, and then after taking control, they'd move the population out, catalog everything, and then based upon shares, redistribute them. He also institutionalized giving shares to the widows and orphans of fallen soldiers, which actually helped to incentivize the soldiers sticking around. He effectively used propaganda to undermine his enemies. But I think probably one of the most important was his reorganization of the army on the decimal system. And he built these units of 10, and then a zagun composed of 10 of those for 100, a mingan, 10 of those for 1,000, and then finally 2 men, which would be like a full army of 10,000. And this gave him the opportunity, one, to reorganize people from different tribes into arbans and zaguns and mingans so that they weren't with their traditional kin people. And it gave him a remarkable amount of modularity in order to do this last thing, which was he was a genius at taking traditional tactics and then recomposing them and reorganizing in new ways that completely surprised his enemies, even when they knew the same tactics. But his ability to reorganize them and use them in an overall strategy was unprecedented, and it had to do with these organizational capacities.
I mean, but there seems to be something that makes it very plastic, which is that there is, like, as you were saying, at the level of, it's not really an empire built on the basis of expanding a kinship or community structure that existed before, but there is two movements of breaking with, right? Because I mean, in the idea that you get to start building some power, whereas when one community dominates over another, that means that basic state structure actually usually supposes that you preserve the community structure under the new dominant structure. But here in this case, I think it's very interesting as a kind of paradigm also, because it's not a continuum, right, between the kinship structure that already existed and the new empire, the kind of state empire sort of structure. But actually, as it is built, it acquires a more nomadic kind of feel rather than a grounded feel that it's based on keeping or expanding a certain form of community that already existed, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So this is the the rise to power. This is the formation of Mongolia, like as an entity.
And the Yuan dynasty, like that's where Dennis comes from.
Yes. Important turning point in history.
for a whole variety of reasons. But that was all imminent to Mongolia, this is the first actual, quote, invasion and conquest is of northern China, the Jin or Jurchen dynasty. So real quick, the Weatherford says that there are 3 really distinguishing things about the Mongol army that made it very different. So that was much smaller, and it was famous for beating much larger armies all the time. It was composed entirely of cavalry. There were no infantry, and it was self-sustaining. There was no logistical support line. They carried everything they needed to eat with them. And so that made for an incredibly mobile, like you're saying, Gabriel, like unprecedented mobility.
Yeah, but the reason why I said that is because that makes a weird case for what you call a logistical structure, because there wasn't the center to maintain so much as a sort of nomadic unit, right?
Yeah, that was actually a major problem. Genghis Khan never had a city, and his son built a city. And a lot of people saw that as like a part of the problem of like the empire starting to break down, because Genghis Khan always maintained in his own court a level of mobility that enabled him to do everything he did. And all of those things that we tend to look at as kind of like signs of decadence, right? Kind of like came out of the moment when they built this city and concentrated things.
Yeah, it is, because it seems to me that the entry of more classic logistical problems, which is centralization, unification in that sort of static sense, right? Where you have a center and you need to hold things with the center. That's actually already the beginning of the end, from what you're saying.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's much more a problem that comes up rather than I think the core logic of the state. Yeah. All right, so they're in northern China. They're being really fast and scary. What are they doing? they're attacking multiple locations, which is not the way war is normally fought. And they're using civilians, quite literally using civilians. They would round up peasants and then use them as human shields and round them towards the cities. If there were moats, they'd push the peasants into the moats in order to get over them. And then if they had no
sounds very modern to me. You're right.
Yeah, exactly right. They're all very modern and biopolitical. They would use them to push their siege weapons and stuff. Once Genghis Khan started learning about siege weapons, I mean, the Mongolian capacity to like absorb new technology and redeploy it is fascinating and amazing. But they took all these technologies, siege weapons, and what were called fire lances, which were kind of like pipe early guns, you know, but they mostly just, they spread fire. They didn't really like shoot things yet, but they were terrifying, right? And they could set things on fire. And again, this gets very much into logistical, like just the way the state will just level things. They just destroy tons of rural communities in order to produce pasture land so that they can maintain mobility with their cavalries. So they'd level entire communities. Later, they would level entire cities if they didn't fit onto the Silk Road for logistical purposes.
So if they didn't have, instead of horses, they had corporations, they pretty much would be totally, like they would have, if they had modern weapons of commercial destruction, they would be like totally kind of fitting to our world today.
Exactly, like, that's what I'm saying. There's a way in which it's a very modern, and they kind of prefigure a lot of what's about to emerge. During the invasion of the Muslim nations, they got even more biopolitical. They would execute the soldiers, and then they divide the civilians by profession and distribute the civilians throughout the rest of the empire, depending on what part needed engineers or doctors or scribes or whatever, right? When Genghis Khan invaded northern China, he tried to make alliances with the rich and elites, and once he left, they were the major conspirators against him. So when he invaded the Muslim nations, he just skipped that step and eliminated all the rich and elites and put his own people up, and also promoted from the locals based upon merit once again. And then again, he would level entire cities to make the Silk Road easier to follow. So what are some of the administration innovations? Unprecedented levels of standardization of roads, measures, and money. They successfully introduced paper money for some time, and under the guy, dang, I'm going blank, in China, under the Golden Khan. I can't remember his name.
Kublai?
Yes, Kublai, thank you. They had a successful paper money system, which ended up being, collapsing with the next dynastic wars, but it did successfully last. Unprecedented religious tolerance. There's a really great story, actually. This guy thinks that the first true ecumenical debate happened in one of the Khan's courts, when a Buddhist, a Christian, and a Muslim debated each other. And the debate went, at first they tried to debate each other and couldn't convince either one. So then the Christians started singing, the Muslims started chanting, and the Buddhists started meditating. And when that didn't convince anyone, they all just got drunk together. So that was the first ecumenical discussion moderated by the Mongols.
Otherwise, they would just kill the three anyway. So they
that's the point.
They better conciliate.
It was great. Genghis Khan abolished torture. So, killed a lot of people, but efficiently at least.
Elegantly.
He instituted diplomatic immunity, and he actually started several wars just because people killed his envoys. So started the tradition of immunity of envoys and diplomatic immunity. They attempted a mass literary campaign under Kublai again, and then they brought and utilized widely and helped to develop the technologies of printing presses, gunpowder weapons, and compasses to Europe, which Francis Bacon said were the three technologies that are the cornerstones of early modern modernity. So we get those directly from the Mongols.
But if I'm following correctly, like the underlying argument that I think your presentation kind of reinforces is that even if there is a more canonical genesis of the state in allegiance or reinforcing what we described as this mode A, right, transcendental. So in the positive side of communities, that the existence of the Mongol Empire and the fact that it shares many properties with modern European empires shows that you can actually have a lot of the, not only have many of the properties of an empire without that underlying communal structure, but actually thriving on the absence of it, right? I mean, it seems like it's an empire built to have a better dialogue with commerce and dynamical flows than with static kind of communities, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And
So
in
in
fact,
that sense, it looks more like something that is in dialogue with a late capitalist logistical state in that sense, right?
Yeah.
Even though it avoids the classical problems of logistics and state, which are more like central cities, the relation between center and margin, how do you get, like the chain of command centralized.
something that's very in line with contemporary capitalism is after the invasion of the Muslim nations, or the Muslim countries, which were largely city-states, right? There was a huge destruction of manufacturing capacities. And the Mongols used this as an opportunity to extend Chinese exports to the Muslim nations, which still had lots of wealth to purchase, right? So they directly, intentionally built up commercial relationships on the basis of military operations and using like, all right, we're going to destroy this and then establish a commercial relationship and benefit off of this and whatnot. So there's a lot of the ways in which they looked at things and managed things from the perspective, especially because after they'd gone around and conquered and looted, you couldn't just keep looting and going with a primary tribute system. So as the empire shifted post-conquest, the way that the Khan system maintained power and connections between themselves was through commercial connections. And they had holdings in each other's empires, and they managed each other's assets, and they would like had this incredibly sophisticated system of allocations and shares that became the bond of the empire as the kind of like logistical state function was breaking down. So you definitely see like this interaction between world empire and world economy that's really interesting. Until you get to this part here, the actual like massive catastrophe of the Black Death, which killed something like a third of the population of the world at the time, and was capable of spreading so quickly precisely because of the Mongol Empire, right? Like all that.
We just makes it even more contemporary.
Yeah, exactly. Let's make this really awkwardly at home right now. Fortunately, we're not dealing with quite the death rates or the like incredibly disgusting things that happen to people with the bubonic death, but definitely seeing the same level of shutdown, including things like there are instances of entire sections of the empire breaking down because a single town was shut down by the plague, but that was a critical junction point in the overall empire. So like the way that like it wasn't just that lots of people died, it was also that it was distributed unevenly, and sometimes that distribution hit really key junction points in the logistical infrastructure. So again, you have that idea from Rota of like the facticity only emerges when it breaks down, but when it breaks down, it like completely shifts the viewpoint. Conceptual problems. So yeah, you have this move from kinship and affinity to loyalty, and loyalty was a central concept for Genghis Khan. He would in fact execute people that betrayed their own leaders when they came over to him. He would accept people if they just left their leaders, but if they killed their leader or kidnapped them or stole from them, he would kill them, because for him, loyalty was the kind of substance that was replacing kinship affinity. It was the thing that was like connecting it. And you either, again, it was a 0-1. You either were loyal to the Khan or you weren't. There weren't space for intermediary relations. Tribute versus commerce, like I was just saying, there was a shift from a primarily extractive plunder, literal plunder-based economy, to one that was based more on commerce and exchange value. Regulations and rules. I think what's important, I'm trying to draw a distinction between regulations and rules, which I think are more imminent to TB, and laws, which again, I think are something composite that come out. Rivalries give us a different kind of fragmentation in this world. And unlike Lefebvre, where exchange drives fragmentation, in TB and world economy or in world empire, commerce actually provides a unifier. So we see a change in exchange when it's dominated by TB. It actually helps connect things. Once it becomes the dominant thing, it becomes a principle of fragmentation. So there's a really interesting kind of like shift there. Shift in perspective. This goes back to the tribute versus commerce. Let me go back here for a second. So you had this. This is a little bit bigger than Genghis Khan's time, but you had a single empire that within 2 generations broke down into these 3 khanates. And as the kind of state logistical system got kind of cut up, like I said, the way they maintained relationships were through a system of basically commercial contracts and obligations in terms of, Kublai owned shares in the Golden Horde, and the Golden Horde owned shares down in Persia, and so on and so forth, right?
I love that one of them wanted to have like the best name, like the Golden Horde, like just
exactly, right?
the other the great Khan.
This idea of sovereignty still held because formally they were under Kublai Khan and the Golden, or the Great Khan to the east as like the main Khan, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they were still formally under this person as sovereign, but his like the capacity to occupy the sovereign space was breaking down. So in order to shift, they had to kind of occupy the space of commerce. Universalization of law. I think that's an interesting thing the Mongols did, especially considering how much the Europeans like to talk about coming up with that. So I just want to explore that more. And then Francis Bacon, when he did, like, I grew up, the reason the Mongols won was because they were super barbaric and savage. Francis Bacon, one of the kind of like early modern thinkers, argued that the Mongols were successful because they were a people of science, that they, and a people of philosophy, I think he said, people of philosophy and science, that they looked at things scientifically, they broke things down and analyzed them scientifically, and they approached their problems in a problem-solving way. And that's why they won. And Weatherford, the author of this book, takes pains to show, like, look, the amount of violence and barbarity and torture going on at this time is, the Mongols did not go beyond it anyway. What they did was they did things much more effectively, and according to Weatherford, could afford to be less barbaric because they were more effective. So the rest of this goes into the United States and logistics and stuff, as well as cyber issues. But we're also past 3 hours. So I got the main concepts down. There's a lot of cool stuff I'd like to get into, but it could be another presentation down the road. I don't want to overgo at this point, and I think there's plenty to chew on.
No, it was amazing, man.
So I just wanted to go there. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, that was some really interesting stuff. Thank you, John.
Even before the maps, I was already.
I'm glad we could get to the maps though, because that would be unfair to tease you all and then walk away without some cartography.
Yeah, it's really good with the maps because that gives us I think, a concrete way to interpret the gluing and the sheaves metaphor. Because unlike the bargaining spaces thing that we tried to do in the primer, like a map of the world seems pretty, like, way more intuitive, and like actually the logistical nature of the state is like maps onto the world, right?
Yeah, I think that Alain left, but he asked a question that I think after you presented the maps and what Dennis said makes a much more sense, which is the problem with capital and accumulation is not even that it accumulates objects, right? We already saw that. I mean, capital is not even accumulating like wealth in the sense of material wealth. Capital accumulates some specific capacity of composing things out of things, and it's a sort of compositional accumulation, right? It's not spatial. It doesn't take up space necessarily. It doesn't also connect space necessarily, right? But states seem to be, I mean, I think the Lefebvre connection really clarified, was really helpful to, you accumulate space. I mean, nobody's going to show a state that takes like a tenth of this size and say it was a huge state. Like, you are accumulating territory in a weird way, right? And it is kind of weirdly about us spreading in space and connecting and making distant things becoming close together, right? So there is something, I agree. I think that it makes these maps not be simply like a nice classic way of visualizing trajectories, but like these lines, red, yellow, lines of commerce and things like this. They make sense from the perspective of what it means to produce spaces, right?
Yeah.
And it's weird because if you remove the state boundaries, the imperial boundaries that are at stake, for example, in the Mongolian Empire, but other empires would do the same. These lines, just as commercial routes, they're not really connecting things in the sense that it's not about the spaces being glued together, right? Capital is not really interested into making the world smaller, for example, or more connected. That's not really. That's only from the perspective of resources, right? That's why, I mean, from Silk Roads and the new Chinese project, the
New Silk Road.
The new Silk Road. I mean, it's always about the logistical level. It's much more clearly about kind of producing disconnected, or you could call it homogeneous space, right? Whereas it's not really about that with capital. Like when you say capital associated with globalization or something like this, it's not really about the size of the world, right? Or it's something slightly different that you are covering, right? And I think the same goes for reciprocity, where community, for example, you can have 10 people and have 1,000 communities.
Yeah.
So it's not really also measurable in space, right? I would even say, like, to be very, very speculative and blunt, we could say that communities accumulate time, right? Because it's all about connecting the past with the present, inheriting something, going beyond your generation and something like this. States seem to accumulate space. And then capital accumulates that third coordinate, which is neither space nor time, which would be, it accumulates, in my opinion, more like resolutions than spaces and time.
Yeah, no, that works. It also just further makes the triplicate cover everything. We get all three logics.
I mean, come on.
We get all three dimensions of space and time. We get all of autonomy.
We're
gonna be more Hegel than Hegel by the end of this. We're gonna have a triad that covers all the things.
Who doesn't like to have triads that cover everything?
It's gonna be a Borromean knot made of Borromean knots.
Exactly.
Yes. Beautiful.
No, but it makes a lot of sense. I do think that what Alain said about power and sovereignty, there might be some nice tweaking there that will make that kind of.
I definitely would like to try to have a conversation with him one-on-one, because I'm not as well versed in like state theory and right theory and stuff. So it'd be really good to kind of take this logistical, meet it with that, and see what we can
I think it would definitely work. When he left, unfortunately, but he's studying exactly this. Like, he's doing analogies with Marx on the one hand, which he studied a lot. He's studying kind of structural anthropology on the other side, but he's focused on the theory of the state. So it really fits. I'm sure he can help you out with some ideas as well. Man, but this was amazing.
Sweet. Well, any other thoughts or anything? Because otherwise I'm good. We can do the rest of the stuff another time. I actually could definitely stand to organize it, make more diagrams, all that fun stuff.
If you want to meet at some time, I mean, sorry, Dennis, sorry.
I was just going to say we should definitely talk more about it. Yeah, it was a lot to digest, but it's very interesting, very complex.
Yeah, I'd like to get a little into the math side of this too. If you need that, let me know.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it shouldn't be hard to find. For example, in people who study social networks, I know they have already some models that combine this sort of network of relations with like just classical values for connected or not connected, and there might be something there. But I really think if we take some time with this, that the stupid idea of this adherence function with two values, and we just kind of backtrack and go through the transcendental logic, I think it can really derive most of these ideas, and the only advice I would give, which I think your example with the Mongol Empire was really helpful in this, is that sometimes it's hard to have your eye on a contemporary phenomena, like for example, the ubiquity of logistics and the logistical state and so on, but need to reconstruct things from a perspective where that wasn't there.
Yeah.
Like when Dennis and I were talking and constructing stuff in the primer, I felt like there was always a temptation to skip ahead from the very rudimentary stuff Marx is describing and try to talk about derivatives and the financial system, right? It's really hard to say, okay, I'll like look for a weirdly pure form of this and I'll trust that this will fit later on, you know? Because, for example, what you presented today is a logistical space that never really gets embedded into this territory. Everything that you describe is movable. They are movable. The technologies are movable, like printing presses, paper, knowledge, right? It never gets ingrained. And when it does, it falters, right?
Yeah, that's where the problems come in. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind, that it really takes ridiculous capital to shape the world in such a way that you can have logistics really ingrained into the urban space, right? For a very, 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 very long time, I think that if you settle, you don't have the power to make space really shaped that way. And if you're movable, the way this more nomadic kind of Mongol empire is, it exists in a highly sophisticated way only as long as you're moving, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But now we know that commodities are Mongols, at least. Commodities are structured like Genghis Khan.
Well, I mean, there was that, breaking down the Chinese wall metaphor. So I think they're from the Communist Manifesto. So it's becoming more literal now.
Yes.
So.
No, but this was amazing, man.
Very nice. Thank you, John.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks you for all listening and all the feedback has been super helpful, and I appreciate getting to. Yeah, this is some crazy stuff. So I'm glad to be able to work it out with some folks.
Oh, it was amazing.
See y'all next week.
Yep. See you next week.
Take care.
Guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, John.
You're all welcome. Take care.